Back throughout 2020 and 2021, myself and a very good friend of mine did a Let's Play series of the Halo franchise as the games were released on PC as part of the Master Chief Collection. Our goal was to take a somewhat critical look at the games in ways we felt nobody really had before, focusing mostly on examining their story and storytelling. This included things like how the narrative was presented, how information was delivered, how characters reacted and interacted, and of course the actual contents of the story itself, along with a minor focus on the overall system and level design. It's a conversation about the game you don't see very often. Halo's status as a foundational franchise of console gaming seems to have rendered it immune to deeper questioning. People, young and old, talk about this first game in tones fitting the divine association its name bears, and criticisms are often dismissed or scorned under a mountain of different reasonings and angles. When presenting an opinion, as I'm doing here, you always have to be ready for people to not agree with that opinion. And that's fine, but the sheer fervor with which people have defended this game to me in the past seems to sometimes border on sheer zealotry. They're invested, and they're not going to let me, some random internet guy, even attempt to dull the shine 20 plus years of nostalgia have given this whole thing. So what is it? What makes this game so untouchable? Am I missing something? Is the game really just that good? No, it isn't. It never was. And it's time to admit that. In 2001, the veteran video game company Bungie released Halo, a first-person shooter for the then-new Microsoft Xbox home gaming console. It was an instant hit and has since spawned 7 additional mainline titles, 2 real-time strategy games, 2 top-down twin-stick shooters, an arcade light gun game, well over a dozen novels, an animated series or 2, multiple toy lines in different niches too numerous to put into this graphic, at least 3 live-action series, and a coloring book. By every metric, Halo was a successful game. Its influence over the FPS genre still lingers, and despite not many people liking the last decade plus of games to release, it remains a monolithic force that captures millions of both eyes and dollars. But before all of that, before the franchise, there was just one single game. A tiny little chick just emerged from the egg, staring with attentive eyes at all that lay before it, wondering at the possibilities of its new life. Halo, known more appropriately by its full title, Halo Combat Evolved, is a bare-bones first-person shooter with boring weapons, a minuscule enemy roster, amateur-level design, terrible writing, and a story that doesn't just insult your intelligence but downright shows contempt for the idea of critical analysis. I would dispute the game's full title as an outright lie, but as my good friend put it during our playthrough, there are in fact dead ends in evolution. Many people out there laud Halo for hitting a lot of firsts, and they're all mostly wrong. Most of what Halo gets recognized for had been done previously, often better, and Halo itself didn't even necessarily iterate on them in any meaningful way. What really caused Halo to find success was simply the fact that it was released into an ecosystem with absolutely no competitors. You know how every so often you'll read something about some weird animal on some remote island and it's just the most useless thing ever? It can barely find food, it has no problem-solving skills, and you could stick it in a small cage with a hungry tiger and it wouldn't care because its generations of isolation and utter lack of natural predators means that it has no ability to recognize danger? That's Halo. It's not like Halo doesn't have any positive points at all. It does, and I'll be happy to explore them when they come up, because ultimately, what Halo is good at tends to be ignored by the developers themselves in favor of far worse decisions. It's annoying, because the good parts could be even better if Bungie had ever recognized that they had them, but they just got buried instead. But that's for the future. We have to look at the past. Halo's a game that feels 3 years out of date, like one among the first wave of games vying to eat some of Half-Life's pie, but not understanding what made that game work. On the PC side of the gaming world, those games had already come and gone, and better lessons were being learned at this turn of the new millennium. 2001 wasn't the most momentous of years for computer FPS players, but it had its titans all the same. If I may indulge in a bit of alternate history speculation for a moment, It seems pretty likely that if Halo had released on PC in 2001, among everything else that was out at the time and would be coming out soon, it would have made a decent splash for one or two notable reasons, been criticized pretty heavily for its many shortcomings, and then fallen out of the public eye as better and more interesting things overtook it. On Microsoft's new console, however, there was only Halo, and if there's only one game to play, it doesn't have to be good, it just has to be there at all. Plenty of shooters touting themselves as Halo killers would come out immediately after, and most of them were honestly pretty bad on their own rights, not just compared to this game. Like with Half-Life's many imitators, they didn't understand what was needed to make a successful game. They were trying to get in quick while hype levels were high, one step above the ground floor, as it were. But nowhere in this flurry of new console-forward first-person shooters did anyone actually stop and ask if Halo was something worth imitating. All the C-suite executives just saw that Halo had made money. That was enough for them to demand their developers follow what they figured was a winning formula. But the fact was, they were actively chasing mediocrity, and it seemed like people weren't going to be fooled a second time. To properly discuss this game, I need to set it all up first. I'm not going to do a huge focus on the rest of the story quite yet, but I'd like to get a brief synopsis out of the way before we continue. This will just make it easier to bring up certain other things, and I won't have to explain the context for something when I just want to point at it for a couple seconds. This entire thing is going to be a little more than your average story recap, I promise, just look at the runtime, but that much still needs to get done. The story of Halo follows one Master Chief of the United Nations Space Command, a genetically and cybernetically enhanced super soldier in BMX power armor, as he flees a dying vessel under attack by an alien foe known as the Covenant. Entrusted with a sapient AI named Cortana, he escapes to a nearby superstructure floating in space, the titular Halo, where he'll spend the next few hours killing aliens in order to escape the ring. That's the gist, and of course there are some plot elements that come in later in the story, but the setup is clean enough. In practice, though, things fall apart very quickly. Let's just focus on the beginning for a moment to really get a picture of where everything kicks off. We start in medias res. A ship called the Pillar of Autumn, which definitely isn't the Sulaco from Aliens, why would you say that, has apparently just completed an emergency hyperspace jump, as two voices tell us. These belong to Cortana, introduced both here and in the game's manual as the shipboard AI, and Captain Keyes, the shipboard captain. According to them, the ship has been followed, and they're taking things fairly seriously. Meanwhile, we listen to a short speech given by a sassy sergeant who definitely isn't Apone from Aliens, why would you say that, as he rallies the ship's standing troops for battle. This transitions into a short scene of two technicians being given the order to wake our player character up from cryosleep in order to be the big hero. We get a small tutorial, and then we're told that the aliens have successfully boarded, we are under attack, and we need to make our way to the bridge to speak with the captain. All good so far. Then we get a somewhat lengthy scripted sequence of escaping the cryosleep bay, watching as the ship goes to hell around us, and seeing the invading alien force make their way through our very fragile human crew. When we eventually get to the bridge, Captain Keyes explains we are no match for the invaders, it's time to abandon ship, and we must protect Cortana at all costs because as the ship's navigational and tactical AI, she has in her memory all sorts of highly classified information important to the war effort, and he puts special emphasis on the fact that if she were captured, the Covenant would learn the location of Earth.
I understand.
She makes a comment here that very clearly makes it seem like this is the first time she and our protagonist have worked together in this capacity.
Your architecture isn't much different from the Autumn's.
Don't get any funny ideas.
Please do your best to remember all of that, it will be very important. So off we go through the raging battle, accompanied by music that definitely isn't James Horner's score from Aliens, why would you say that? Let's speed things up a bit, just hit the absolute most necessary highlights of each level. Okay? Let's go. After being given our pistol, we fight through some rooms and lots of hallways to reach the Pillar of Autumn's escape pods. We launch, but a malfunction causes a crash, killing everyone but ourselves. From our crash site, we make our way to a structure where a group of Marines have gathered to fight off a small force of Covenant. A trio of additional life pods touch down nearby, and we're sent to make contact with each one so that a dropship can come collect them. When we're done, we learn that Captain Keyes was captured and is being held on a Covenant vessel. After a short ride, we arrive at a small forward base. Fighting our way up to the ship's gravity lift, we enter and make it to the brig to free Keyes. Cortana reveals that she's learned that the Covenant already knew about the Halo and regarded it as both some kind of religious artifact and a weapon. Fearing the weapon will be used against the human race, Keyes announces that we must find our way to the ring's control room. We make our escape in a stolen Covenant dropship soon after. We pick up an unknown amount of time later, already on our way to a map room that Cortana hopes will lead us to the control center. It takes a bit of doing, but eventually we make it there and learn the location we're after. Trying to contact Keyes again is a bust, however, but we continue on, taking our dropship down into a ring-wide network of tunnels. Exiting the tunnel system, we assault our way to the control room. Inserting Cortana's little USB stick into a console, she accesses the ring's systems and begins learning things about it. She reveals that it's a Forerunner structure, apparently intended to house something dangerous, which she tells us Keyes is about to uncover. We rush off to stop him. Sometime later, we arrive in a swamp at the location of the captain's last transmission. Going inside a nearby structure, we find a Marine's helmet cam with footage that reveals the existence of a new enemy faction. We're ambushed and escape the facility, at which point we meet a strange floating robotic orb who introduces himself as 343 Guilty Spark, calls himself a Monitor, names the creatures as the Flood, and teleports us away. We end up in the library, and the Monitor tells us that we need to collect the index to activate the Halo's weapon, which is apparently not just the Flood like Cortana thought it was. We fight our way to the thing and grab it, then get teleported back to the control room. Walking back up to the console, we insert the index and prepare to activate the Halo. Cortana suddenly appears to admonish us for attempting to do this, and gets the Monitor to explain that while the Halo's weapon will kill the Flood, it will also kill all life in the galaxy. Not happy with this solution, the Master Chief declines to proceed with the activation, angering Guilty Spark, who sicks a group of sentinels on him as Cortana steals the index. Escaping that encounter, Cortana explains her intent to destroy the Halo in order to stop the Monitor by blowing up the Pillar of Autumn. Concerned that the Monitor may still be able to activate the Halo without the index, she also has the Master Chief destroy 3 things that control the ring's primary firing mechanism. We set off to do so. Meanwhile, Cortana finally locates the Pillar of Autumn and tells us we need Captain Keyes to initiate the ship's destruction sequence. After blowing up the 3rd generator, Cortana uses her newfound teleportation powers to move us directly to Captain Keyes' location. We arrive at a Covenant cruiser and the captain's transponder marks him as still alive. Despite his orders, we press on and eventually find him bound up in a Flood cocoon, transformed. Giving him a merciful death, we take his neural implant and set off back towards the Pillar of Autumn. Once there, we begin making our way back to the bridge to initiate an overload of the engines. Cortana gets that set up, but the Monitor has followed us and stops the countdown. We make new plans to detonate the engines manually. After doing so, we escape to an indoor rally course, we drive a Warthog through until reaching a shuttle and fly away from the Halo as the Pillar of Autumn detonates, sending giant chunks of the ring flying all throughout space. A sequel is implied, and credits roll. Now that we have a general overview of the story out of the way, let's look at how we'll be interacting with it on our way from the bridge all the way back out into space. I promise you need to know this. One of the first things to notice about Halo's gunplay is that you can only carry 2 weapons, swapping between them with 1 button press. This is a choice the game makes, and whether or not any individual person agrees with it isn't necessarily what I'm here to deal with. I'll say, though, that the existence of the 2-weapon system causes problems that I don't think many people realize, and I'll talk about that later. Right now, we'll just focus on the fact that you will only ever have 2 weapons at once. You can, however, freely pick up other weapons off the ground, which drops the one you're carrying if both weapon slots are occupied. Extra ammo for the guns you're currently carrying is picked up automatically by walking over fallen weapons of the same type, common in the genre, unless they don't use ammo, and there are very few places where you'll find freestanding ammo pickups like in other games. You also have access to 2 types of grenades. Humans use fragmentation, and the Covenant use plasma. Frag grenades bounce a little, while plasma grenades famously stick to whatever object they land on. In this game, grenade pickups in the environment can be activated by other explosions, such as rocket impacts or other grenades. It's fun. Rounding out your combat abilities is a melee attack, made with whatever weapon you're currently holding rather than just being a distinct weapon equipped like in other games. Pressing the melee button just bops someone with your gun, and melee strikes from the back are exponentially more powerful than those from the front, letting you assassinate unaware enemies. Melee is also silent, which comes into play the few times you might come across a room full of sleeping or otherwise unaware enemies. There are two power-ups in the game, overshields and invisibility. Both are uncommon and their benefits are limited. The overshield by the damage you take, and the invisibility by time. An overshield gives you an effective 2 extra layers of shield that isn't necessarily any stronger or weaker than the one you already have, while invisibility makes you totally invisible to enemies until you fire or it wears off. The invisibility does persist for the entire duration even if you start shooting, though with far reduced effect, and you can regain the full cloak if you don't fire or take damage for a couple seconds. Speaking of shields, you do indeed have some. The game uses a relatively novel but not exactly unique implementation of the common first-person shooter health and armor scheme. Your shields take damage before any of your health is lost, unlike most games where common armor merely mitigates incoming damage. The shields also recharge after a short period of not taking damage, so you always have at least them to rely on. To give a direct comparison, they work identically to the Protoss unit shields from StarCraft. You do also have more traditional health, which doesn't recharge and is quite limited by comparison. This can be refilled with the somewhat rare health kit, which puts you back up to full no matter how much damage you've taken. You learn all of this in the first level relatively organically. The game does a fine job of just letting you take the reins and figure these concepts out on your own with only mild on-screen prompting on lower difficulties. To help you along this path of learning, the first level pits you up against 2 enemies, elites and grunts. Grunts are short, don't move much in combat, and have relatively low health. Elites are tall, try to be somewhat agile to the point of moving away from thrown grenades and weaving around if your crosshairs over them, and have higher health as well as shields that match your own. These alien enemies use alien guns, which you can pick up for yourself. These are the plasma pistol and the plasma rifle, effectively counterparts and side grades to the weapons you've otherwise already seen on offer from your human allies. The pistol is a semi-automatic affair with a pretty rapid fire rate, though you can hold down the fire button to charge up a more powerful shot. The rifle is fully automatic by comparison. Both are also battery-powered rather than loaded with magazines, and when the battery is empty you'll have to drop the weapon for a fresh one. Instead of reloading, then, their batteries can overheat, forcing a short cooldown period where you're unable to fire. These energy weapons are also highly effective against shields, making them an obvious choice for dealing with the beefier elites. To match the hordes of enemies, you'll find plenty of more human-shaped AI buddies. They'll follow you until either they die or the friendly pathfinding runs out. They're also a talkative bunch and will often call out various things like if they're taking fire or if they've just killed an enemy.
Go, go, go! You can't hide from me! Roger that! Covering fire! Frag out!
A bit of a liability sometimes too, unfortunately.
Great!
I'd say that at least they're trying their best, but sometimes that doesn't really feel like it's the case. Yeah, keep going, buddy, you'll get there eventually. And to Halo's credit, all of this comes together to honestly make a pretty elegant combat experience. There's a legitimately very smart decision being made with the difference between human and alien weapons, and that's a split between hit scan damage and projectiles. To give you an accurate enough rundown if you're unfamiliar, a hit scan weapon is one that applies damage instantly to the area where the crosshairs are pointing when the trigger is pulled, and a projectile weapon fires an object that must physically travel from one location to another. What this ends up meaning is that an enemy will never point something at you that you don't theoretically have a chance to avoid. This is smart. Enemies with hit scan weapons lead to unavoidable damage being taken regularly, and it can be a very cheap way to increase difficulty. Walking around a corner or through a doorway and being blasted with instant damage isn't challenging, it's just obnoxious. Between your enemies having projectile weapons with, I should mention, highly visible effects, another point in Halo's favor, and your recharging shields, combat becomes a series of interesting risks to take. Getting your shields back reliably means you aren't afraid to lose them. Being able to dodge enemy fire encourages movement, but you also aren't punished too harshly for not doing it perfectly. Get in a big fight, make some aggressive moves, maybe lose a couple pips of health in the process, but it's not too bad because you always know you have your shields to rely on next time. As you get lower on health, it forces you to play a little more conservatively because you don't know when you might be able to top up again. Suddenly your pool of shields doesn't feel all that large, and you're keenly aware of the warning tone when they're broken and need to recharge. This is good, they've done a good job with this. Some problems arise alongside it, however. Something Halo also puts a lot of attention into is diegetic item placement, like how Half-Life did it, but kind of even more so. To make something diegetic is to make it come from and fit with the world. When a movie has a scene's music coming from a stereo somewhere in the room, that music's diegetic. So Halo makes an effort to place items in locations where it would make sense in-universe. During the attack on the Pillar of Autumn, you pick up weapons and grenades not just from fallen Marines and crewmen, but weapon lockers. You get alien weapons from dead aliens. Inside the Covenant boarding craft, you can find the game's first overshield pickups. Clearly these were intended to be used by the troops inside. There are no weapons in the middle of a room, hovering a foot off the ground, spinning gently, waiting for you to grab them. There are no lines of ammo pickups or armor shards waiting for a player. And this is fine, you know, it's an effort they made, and it's an interesting one. But it's one that leads to some issues. Of course, you won't find human weapons inside a Covenant cruiser, that wouldn't make sense for them to be there. And neither will you find health packs. This is, perhaps, the game's biggest balancing issue, at least on difficulties above normal. Certain levels become quite difficult not because of the challenge created by interesting enemy encounters or level design, but simply because there isn't anywhere it makes sense for a designer to have put a health pack. Because, despite my praises of the combat dance, that only really applies to the more open areas where you have room to maneuver and obstacles to put between you and your enemies. A large bulk of the fighting you do in this game takes place in hallways. From humans to Covenant to Forerunner, they all just love building square hallways in 90-degree corners. Add in a sluggish player movement speed and a slow, floaty jump, and your options for actually doing that maneuvering end up being pretty limited. It's a good system that just isn't given the room it needs to breathe. And speaking of limited, those grunts and elites with their plasma rifles and plasma pistols, yeah, that ends up being a full half of the Covenant enemy roster and 2 of the 3 alien guns, all introduced in the very first level. The third variety of enemy, the Jackal, comes in right afterward, and so does the Needler, the third and final weapon. It's another rapid-fire projectile weapon, though the needles it's named after do have a minor tracking built into them, and the gun itself uses a magazine like your own human weapons. It's not a promising start, and honestly, an argument could be made that the first level shows you more than half the enemy roster, given that the hunters that are introduced later aren't the common chaff that the other 3 are. They're saved as the rare, surprising mini-boss encounters where they show up in pairs, at least in theory, though the dismal amount of options Bungie gives themselves to build encounters with means that you'll sometimes come across duos of them almost back-to-back. By late game, you should basically expect them every few minutes. It gets old really quickly, turning what should be a sudden, tense engagement into a roll of the eyes and a muttered, "These guys again?" And honestly, they don't really tend to be that difficult in this game anyway. They go down with a single pistol shot to the back on any difficulty, which lends even more into their eventual status as annoying speed bump, rather than the threat they're supposed to represent. Some of you might already be heading to the comments to give me a "well actually." I hear you, and yes, there are different colors of Grunt and Elite flavored as their ranks. In this game, Grunts come in red and orange flavors, while Elites are typically blue or red. There are also the uncommon white Elites, white armored, I should clarify, and the fairly rare gold Elites. And then there's some very rare black armored versions of both that only show up at the end of the game. What does all of this mean? In this game in particular, not a lot. In RPGs, there's the concept of the palette swap. This is where you take an enemy that already exists and make a copy of it that just has different colors. These typically show up a little later in the game than the original, or maybe one is meant to be a leader version of the basic ones. The thing is, though, these aren't exactly different enemies. They have the same basic abilities and can be dealt with the same way. Sometimes they might have different elemental moves, like one's fire and another's ice, but they're still functionally the same. It's generally seen as an easy way to pad out the enemy roster and not much else. A way to reuse art and say that one enemy is 2, or 3, or 5. Even in a more modern, more intricate game like Monster Hunter, variant monsters like Stygian Zinogre versus regular Zinogre are understood to be fundamentally the same enemy, just with a slightly expanded moveset. You still approach them the same way, and your knowledge of the original version is still relevant. As in other games, Halo introduces very minor differences between enemies of the same kind, but ultimately there's no real mechanical change to how you approach a blue elite versus a red elite. They act the same way and they move the same way. One has more shields, that's the only difference. Where this gets used most effectively, at least, is in games where you end up outgrowing the basic enemies, leaving their first incarnations behind and moving on to always having to deal with their beefier or more aggressive versions. We'll talk a little bit more about the actual combat progression later, but to give you a teaser, Halo doesn't do this. You never leave blue elites behind. Red elites have more shields and would be the obvious next step to base all encounters off of, and then eventually move entirely to gold or black elites, but you don't start seeing any of them more frequently as the game goes on. There's no journey here, nothing to test the abilities you've been honing over the course of the game, and oh boy will we talk about why. To bring it back to the RPG comparison, this is like starting out by fighting moderately larger than normal rats and ending the game doing the exact same thing. At least give the rats angry eyebrows or something. Now, Halo does try to shake things up a little bit by also giving the different colors of enemy different weapons. Sometimes. Not actually that much in this game, given that the Covenant arsenal is so tiny. In fact, nobody other than an elite will even ever have a plasma rifle, so that leaves the grunts and jackals to figure out who gets the other two guns what day of the week. And even though the white elites can turn invisible, that doesn't really change enough about them to make them feel like distinct enemies. In Doom, a Pinky and a Spectre aren't really different monsters, after all. What does change things more is the fact that both the invisible and the gold elites can have energy swords. This is a weapon that's unavailable to the player, but does introduce a threat that simply isn't offered by any of the other enemy and weapon combinations. A fast-moving, close-range enemy does stand out among what else is available. And this is admittedly where the palette swap comment isn't quite as accurate. A gold elite with a sword is noticeably different than a blue elite with a plasma rifle, pointing to how weapons can make just as much of an impact in an encounter as the enemy itself. But this is an obvious outlier. Everything else you're put up against, 99% of what you'll fight, isn't different enough to stand out. Now, there is one other addition. The black armored grunts get special fuel rod guns in the last handful of levels. Just like the sword elites, the actual threat introduced by this otherwise unavailable weapon does change encounters in a noticeable way, and the explosion that prevents you from picking up the gun adds a post-death hazard to worry about. But the issue is that you just don't see these enemies that much. Even on the hardest difficulty, you won't see more than a handful of sword elites, and the fuel rod guns only show up at the end of the game, and even then only once where long-range artillery fire can be a real hazard. In the very last level, where you see the most of them, you're in close quarters. They're still grunts, just hit them in the face. It's a persistent issue that I'll mention a lot as we go on. Halo doesn't ever do enough with what it offers. It can make good choices with its designs, but it shies away from it, even when doing so actively hurts the game. But since I'm talking about all these weapons, let's actually take a bit of a closer look at what's on offer. We got the hit scan pistol, projectile pistol, shotgun, rapid fire hit scan weapon, rapid fire projectile weapon, another one of those, rocket launcher, sniper rifle. That's it? With the exception of the projectile pistol and the sniper rifle, this is just the exact same arsenal from Doom. And that's fine, I guess. Doom's collection of weapons was a good one, and these are implemented well enough. You know, the animations and sounds are good, they look nice. The weapons feel good, and combat works well with them. And the issue isn't literally that these are the weapons from Doom. The issue is that, given the crazy ideas the FPS genre was filled with at the time, this is all they went for. The safest options, the least challenging options, the most familiar options. I literally just talked about how a sword and a handheld artillery launcher add so much to the combat. Visuals aside, and they do look good, there's nothing about any of these weapons that makes them unique to Halo. Across 8 years of genre experimentation, during a time that was still pretty willing to do some weird stuff, in a landscape of hive hands, ripjacks, cerebral bores, life leech staves, shrink rays, flat cannons, and whatever the hell Daikatana had going on, Bungie said, nah, we'll just do the usual. Part of the reason combat encounters end up feeling so anemic is because there just simply isn't enough available to fill them with. Bungie has to drop a pair of hunters on you so often because they know you're getting bored of one elite for every 3 grunts and a handful of jackals to give you more of an excuse to throw grenades. The Covenant weapons are all also just very similar in function, which really doesn't help things. These are all mid-range weapons with a relatively rapid fire rate, and there's only so much you can do with that. Honestly, I don't think the game uses sword elites or fuel rod gun grunts enough. Again, the changes they introduce to combat are noticeable, and a good heaping handful of them spread around the entire game rather than just the later levels would have done a lot to ease the slog that combat turns into. And of course, I haven't even touched vehicles yet. Halo has vehicles. It's quite famous for them, in fact. Other shooters had vehicles first, but in this case, it's not hard to argue that Halo did just do them the best at that point. On the human side, you got the Warthog, a 3-person jeep with one driver, a side gunner using their own weapon, and a rear gunner on a minigun turret. And the Scorpion, a tank with a large cannon and a smaller machine gun, both controlled by the driver. The Covenant get the Ghost, a light hovercraft with a single driver and twin plasma rifles, the Wraith, an artillery tank, and the Banshee, a single-seater aircraft with twin plasma rifles and a larger fuel rod gun. Technically, there is also the stationary Shade turret, but I think we can all agree that doesn't really count as a vehicle. The Wraith is unusable by you, but you'll get 1 or 2 chances to use everything else across the campaign. But do you see the problem with that? Here's this game built entirely on selling you these big open spaces, and it has the best vehicle driving model ever put into a shooter up until that point, and they try to downplay the vehicles as much as they can. Even Halo's second level, Halo, gives you a Warthog and then immediately puts you in environments where trying to use it feels entirely useless. The next time you get a Warthog is the Silent Cartographer, and there it's only good for a short ride up a shallow hill, well after the main bulk of the fighting is done. It's fully halfway through the game before you even see a Covenant vehicle after the 2 Banshees that show up to annoy you in the second level. It's at least a fun introduction, seeing the plasma fire arc in from off-screen before the tank itself is revealed, but then you're given plenty of rocket launcher ammo and later an entire tank in order to deal with them. Even when you get a Banshee, it's mainly used for moving you between places they didn't build a way for you to reach on foot, and any fighting you do with it feels almost accidental. Bungie seems so scared of the opportunity these vehicles give both the player and themselves that they keep them from you as much as they can, and almost never give you anything to do with them when they do hand them over. So much of this game is being stuck with the same simple collection of weapons, wading through identical enemy encounters on foot for entire levels. And really, you can't talk about Halo's weapons without always going back to the fact that you can only ever carry 2 of them. Part of Halo's whole shtick is that you pick up and drop weapons over the course of any single combat encounter, like you're shopping for vegetables and trying desperately to find the one single red bell pepper without a weird mushy spot. The fact that most human weapons don't come with lots of ammo and that alien weapons have non-rechargeable batteries helps facilitate this constant replacement. This is presented as you making split-second decisions in combat and tougher ones before it. What works best against what enemies, what's worth bringing along to save in case you need it versus being able to use recklessly. If you're carrying an assault rifle and a rocket launcher, you've made a choice to hold on to a bit of power in exchange for only having one tool to deal with everything else ahead of you. On the surface, this feels like an interesting choice to present the player with. In practice, though, it both doesn't matter very much and ends up hindering the encounter design. In an FPS with a collection of weapons you know the player will always have access to and will build up to in a specific order, you can craft encounters around that, using combinations of enemies with different strengths and weaknesses, asking the player to dismantle a little puzzle piece by piece. In Halo, because Bungie couldn't know what you'd be bringing to a fight, every enemy has to be able to be dealt with the exact same way. There are no counters or obvious poor matchups. The worst you could do is dump slightly too many assault rifle bullets into a high-rank elite's shields, but even then, it'll get through them eventually, and then it's just a few more shots until they're down for good. With the small enemy roster and even smaller arsenal, there just aren't any scenarios not covered by something you're all but guaranteed to have on you. Add grenades and your high-powered melee strike into the mix, and 2 weapons is more than enough to deal with anything the game throws at you. And even if it isn't, if you've somehow gotten yourself into a situation where you're carrying 2 things that you absolutely don't want to use on whatever's in front of you, nothing's stopping you from just picking up another weapon. It's what the system actively encourages, after all. Pop 1 grunt and suddenly only having that assault rifle and rocket launcher isn't a problem, because there's a perfectly good plasma pistol right over there. Other than physically having to move over to it, picking up a new weapon isn't functionally different than swapping to something you already had on you. But now, after you made the decision to bring it along over something more all-around useful, another encounter's gone by that didn't give you a good enough reason to shoot a rocket. Do you even bother picking it back up again? What was the point in bringing it all this way only to not be rewarded with an opportunity to use it? Is killing one red elite really that difficult if you just had a plasma pistol to break the shield? If you just had a rocket launcher in your overall collection of weapons with everything else, you'd be encouraged to actually use it more often because it's always there. Even if you got exactly as many shots with it over the course of the entire game, knowing you have it as an option versus worrying about when you won't is going to make you approach things differently. The entire thing comes together to make something that's just extra baggage in place of a system that provably already worked, and for what purpose? Sometimes there's a little extra drama when both your weapons are empty and you need to find something else. But you know what's more exciting than wandering around? Fighting. Games already had a way of restricting your weapon usage and encouraging you to make good decisions about how to approach your enemies. Ammo pickups. In Doom, arguably the best all-around weapon was the plasma rifle, or to give you Halo's equivalent, the plasma rifle. It tore through anything you pointed it at, from basic zombie infantry all the way up to the cyber demon, but you couldn't use it as much as you wanted. Even with a limit of 600 ammo, you burnt through it quick. It was a waste to use the plasma gun on basic enemies except in the most dire of circumstances. Better to save it for Barons of Hell or the common late-game horde of cacodemons. Or, better yet, save its ammo for when you find the BFG. The system of limited ammo pickups lets the effectiveness of each gun be self-regulating, but still allows the player to make a suboptimal decision in exchange for a quick boost in power. Use it too much, and you won't have it when you need it. There's also still a finite amount of each ammo type, with powerful weapons tending to have less overall ammo available compared to the more workhorse choices. But you still get to make your own decisions about how to use these tools to interact with the game. This is, inarguably, more freedom for the player. And this is why I've always hated the phrase weapon sandbox that gets thrown around about these games. There is no sandbox. The idea of a sandbox is that you have all the options laid out before you and you get to choose what you play with. This is a lunchbox. Bungie has packed specific things into a level and you only get what they decide. Not to say that this version isn't without its own merits. Your weapons are taken away from you between each level, so the designers can force your hand when it comes to starting a new chapter, and withhold certain weapons from you until they decide you should have them. They can, because of this, design certain enemy encounters to have different problems for you to solve in less powerful ways, but only for a little while, and only by excluding certain weapons from a level entirely. The level Truth and Reconciliation is the best and most prominent example of this, starting you off with a sniper rifle and tailoring the initial enemy encounters to encourage its use, but then throwing a surprise mini-boss encounter at you at the end. If you were careful with your shots, you have a strong tool against the area's final encounter. Even when you transition from outdoors into the more cramped confines of the Covenant ship, it's a useful weapon to have around just because of its raw power. You have to ask yourself if it's worth keeping a long-range precision weapon on hand to deal with heavier targets, or if the close quarters means it's time for a combination plasma and assault rifle. But this isn't a situation that's repeated often enough. Very few encounters are tailored like this, and more commonly you're just put in an area where any weapon will do the job as well as any other. It also makes it difficult to find ways to reward the player. If you come across an enemy wraith on foot and don't have a rocket launcher, it's gonna be a tough fight. So tough, in fact, that Bungie wanted to make sure that it would never happen. So when you're going to be up against certain odds, there'll be a convenient rocket launcher, cache of grenades, or vehicle somewhere nearby to level the playing field. You can't feel clever for hauling a rocket launcher and a bunch of ammo you found for it across the entire level for this exact moment, because no rocket launcher existed up until right when you needed it. The two-weapon limit that tries to force you to make careful consideration of what you're bringing with you at any given moment is undone by its own existence, because there's no way for the level designer to know what you have on you, so there needs to always be the correct tool somewhere close to the problem that tool is meant to solve. The only thing it accomplishes is preventing you from using any rockets you might have left over from a previous level on, what, a regular group of elites and grunts? Just let the player make that decision. If it turns out to have been a mistake, oh well. Alright, let's take a break from the weapons for a moment and focus on something even more central to the game's presentation. The crosshair. Get it? Because it's in the center. Okay, well, actually it isn't, or wasn't, on the Xbox. The Master Chief Collection lets us PC players change the position to something we're more used to, because Bungie made the decision to lower the crosshair to about a third of the way up the screen instead of being dead center. Now, I'm told that they did this to more or less force players to look up, which is fine, I suppose. Gamers famously never look up, so sure, why not? Just one question. What are we looking up at? Because it certainly isn't any enemies. Halo, despite its expansive areas, is a very flat game when it comes to actual encounters. Fighting through the ship in the first level has you in a room with a stairwell in the middle that you go up, and enemies are on the upper floor of that. And the second encounter in Truth and Reconciliation has some enemies a few feet above you. Sometimes some banshees fly overhead. There's very often no reason to look up. There are no common enemies that warrant looking up, at least not until very late into the game when you fight Sentinel drones. Why was this so important to implement? Duke Nukem, Blood, Quakes 1 and 2, Unreal, Half-Life, and plenty others all had enemies that flew or attached themselves to the ceiling to ambush you. These games naturally made you look up by having danger come from there. You looked up when entering a new area so you didn't get caught by something, not because the game literally took your head and tilted it back for you. Things are rarely above you in Halo, not enemies and barely even the level itself. You spend so much of this game on a single plane, almost never being put in a position with an open room above or below you. If you do travel up or down, it's via some enclosed ramp or secluded elevator that doesn't give you a chance to interact with other elevations. I highlighted Truth and Reconciliation because it's one of the very few times in the entire game that's designed around giving you any sort of height advantage over an enemy group. Even when you get to the absolutely massive assault on the control room or go through it backwards in 2 betrayals, all that space above you is unused. The outdoor segments are physically large, but that space isn't used for anything within the gameplay. Those bridges you cross underneath on the way to the control room are totally empty until you walk out onto them after an elevator ride. Nobody's shooting down from them to hurry you along or make your progress more difficult. This is a narrow canyon with cliff walls hundreds of feet high. Where's the Banshee's strafing run to make our life hell? At the entrance to the control center itself, where's the party at the top of these steep ramps to chuck grenades and rain plasma damage down on us? You know what's wild? Doom put more consideration into 3-dimensional enemy encounters than Halo did, and Doom didn't even have 3 dimensions. But, excuse me, I've unintentionally misled you. Something does come from above, somewhat frequently. During various outdoor encounters, Covenant dropships will arrive to deliver more troops onto the battlefield. They swoop down, firing a powerful gun at you to drop off another handful of troops and fly off again. I can't cite my sources here because this is something I've just generally heard repeated over the years, so apologies if this isn't an official statement made at some point by someone from Bungie. I've heard it said that this is intended to be a more diegetic way to prolong an enemy encounter, giving a game world explanation for why more enemies are showing up when they weren't there before. It does fit with the same philosophy exhibited in regards to item placement throughout the levels, so I'm generally inclined to believe the claim. People have said to me that this is better than the way other games do it because it's more realistic, it makes more sense. It's not just dumping enemies on you, it's different. And sure, credit where it's due, this looks pretty cool. Plenty of other games before Halo had enemies teleport in or otherwise be spawned in the middle of an ongoing fight, and sure, none of those methods were really quite as spectacular as this. But it's not actually any different than those other ways. Enemies are still put into an encounter where there weren't any before. It's not even really a problem that it isn't functionally different, I'm all for a bit of extra flavor, but saying that it is different is wrong. Just like with how picking up a new weapon isn't functionally different from swapping to one you already had, this is just the same concept. Gameplay-wise, it's also nothing special. The lack of enemy and weapon variety rears its head yet again, as the troops spilling out of these armored transports are going to be exactly the same as the ones you just finished taking care of. There is no heavier armed shock troop squad to drop off, nothing that adds to the combat encounter in a way you haven't seen or couldn't prepare for. They won't drop off sword elites or fuel rod gun grunts, or even just a ship full of half a dozen red elites. Nobody ever plops a wraith down in the middle of an on-foot battle. It's going to be a group of 1 elite and 3 grunts, all armed with the same 3 weapons over and over and over again. This is just another in a large collection of missed opportunities. Not that I'm suggesting there needed to be, but there isn't anything controlling the escalation of combat like a wanted system in GTA where the longer your fight goes on, the more troops get dropped off until you finally break through the onslaught. There isn't a system where an elite can run over to one of the communication boxes dotted around all over the place and actively call in reinforcements, giving you a target to try to stop. Wouldn't that be cool? Interactive? Forget about forcing us to look up, how about anything approaching meaningful target prioritization? Killing the elite before he makes the call could prevent the dropship from showing up, but let him get the call off or interrupt him in the middle of it and suddenly you have a big problem in your future. I'd just like to point out that Metal Gear Solid 2 came out the same year as Halo, and this system worked great there. But without something in place to control whether or not these reinforcements arrive, they are functionally just the same thing as when you're done fighting a room full of enemies in Doom and more suddenly teleport in. It's flashy, but it isn't different. With 3 common enemies, each armed with one of 3 guns, seeing more dropped out of the sky when you think you're done stops being fun and becomes aggravating, knowing that you're stuck doing the same thing for that little bit longer. You just enter an area, fight some enemies, wait for more to be dropped off, and then fight them too. Just like any other game. Yet again, setting aside the visuals, this isn't anything we haven't seen before. And between everything I've just discussed, that kinda describes Halo in its entirety. It's nothing that hadn't already been done before, and often done better. But there's one defense that always works, the silver bullet, the argument to silence all negative opinions that might ever be offered. But it's so much fun! You can't tell me I'm not having fun! Fun is subjective. There's no argument there. Anyone can find anything fun, and it's even easier to have fun doing something if you have friends around. Halo on console was famously co-op from day one, and I'm sure that really helped boost people's perception of it. But having fun with friends is almost too easy. That's why you invite them over to help you move. It's why you watch bad movies together that you'd otherwise never touch. But you're right. I can't tell you you're not having fun. I can, however, ask if you're really sure that you are. Halo's moment-to-moment gameplay is fine, good even, but it very quickly reaches the limit of what it has to offer. People will talk about the 30-second loop. Bungie has created a game that works and plays beautifully in 30-second chunks. Shoot, move, reload, throw a grenade. The animations and feedback are good, it's pleasant to look at, there isn't too much visual noise to overwhelm you, but it's also got enough flair from the weapon impacts and muzzle flashes to keep you engaged. Then catch your breath and do it again. And again. And again. These 30 seconds can be fun, sure, but shouldn't a game strive to be better for more than 30 seconds at a time? If that's all that can be managed, where are the high points of excitement? Where are the calmer points of downtime? Halo cages itself into a very cramped existence where it can't ever do anything too impressive, lest you realize that nothing before it came close. Other games in the series would move to their level-by-level set pieces, and ultimately for the better, but this first outing is just so flat. All the restrictions that weigh the game down, the lack of enemies and weapons, the bad level design, are only compounded by Bungie willingly restricting themselves further to make sure that nothing stands out. Every 30-second chunk has to be the same so that you don't start expecting more out of the game. The entire thing artificially smoothed over to make sure there's no chance of anything catching your attention, good or bad. Maybe this is a bit harsh, which is surprising coming from me in this video, I know, but that sort of philosophy seems cowardly. Even understanding the limitations at play with the 3 basic enemies and 3 weapons to give them, and understanding that there may have been even less visible ones, an AI entity limit or a polygon limit that kept them from having 24 enemies in one area, there's so much more that could have been done with what was on offer. I mentioned previously how I thought the game could have used fuel rod gun grunts and sword elites more liberally, enemy vehicles too. Imagine a couple enemy ghosts wandering around those big interconnected zones in the second level. With your own Warthog that just got introduced, that's a fun target to chase down, and a decent way to introduce the vehicle before already having a rocket launcher in hand to take care of it, like what happens in Assault on the Control Room. There's absolutely a world where Halo's combat encounters are more interesting than they ended up being. But Bungie wasn't ever interested in pushing their small pool of resources to its limit. They wanted you to fight 3 grunts and an elite. Why no crowds of grunts? Why no groups of half a dozen elites? Why no forward phalanx of jackals with heavier firepower behind them? Why not 3 hunters? There are ways to make this work, and while the small roster and arsenal would have always been evident, a little effort could still have stretched it a lot further than they did. But that would run the risk of having some encounters be obviously better or worse than others. And if that happens, your focus-tested 30-second loop gets interrupted. That's no good. Halo wants to put you in a fugue state, dim your eyes and cloud the part of your brain that can criticize, all so it can run a looping reel in front of you. Shoot, move, reload, throw a grenade, shoot, move, reload, throw a grenade. By the time the encounter's over, you've forgotten how it started. Do you know why people talk about things like the first Invisible Sword Elite in Truth and Reconciliation, or the introduction of the Flood? Because those are the only spikes in the otherwise motionless graph that is this game's combat progression. From the beginning, you know how it ends, with groups of 3 grunts and an elite. Sure, the Flood and some Sentinels are there now, but the first and last level put you up against not just the exact same hallways, but the exact same enemies. This is where the lack of meaningful progression comes in. Why are we still fighting blue elites? Why are grunts still here at all? Why aren't there more swords to deal with? What's being tested here, other than our patience? Bungie is scared you'll keep wanting more if they ever intentionally give it to you enough times, so they just don't. They keep encounters at a constant plateau and never ask you to really engage that much. They want to be able to shuffle you from level start to level end at a nice, constant pace, without risking that you notice what isn't there. Funny enough, the library is a cataclysmic breakdown of this. Everyone knows the library sucks, with its endlessly repeated hallways and identical drawn-out objectives, but that's not actually fundamentally different from the rest of the game. It's just that, for reasons we'll get into much later in more detail, you're made to see those flaws much more closely. At this point in the game, Bungie has lost control of its rounded corners and soft edges, forced to face the player with much less finished or focused designs. As a result, the difficulty has spiked, and not for intentional reasons. The player is sent back multiple minutes at a time to previous checkpoints again and again, and everything that is already wrong with Halo that you can otherwise be hurried past by the firm, guiding hand of Bungie pressing against your back is suddenly plain and obvious. The 30-second loop is a way to hide, a way to deflect. It's a cheap dopamine hit that can't risk complicating itself for fear of the easy high running out and turning into frustration. It hurts the game, ultimately, by letting, if not forcing, Bungie to constrain themselves. Other games have varied encounters, challenging rooms or sequences that might be a little frustrating but leave you grinning when you get through them, and sure, some slogs too. That's just the nature of taking risks. Sometimes they don't pan out, and then you learn and get better at your craft. But it's these contrasts that drive people's interests, that give them something to talk about. Individual encounters that stand out are a good thing in a game, because otherwise you're just left, standing at the end of a level, blinking in confusion, feeling generally contented, but not really sure what just happened in the last 20 minutes. But it's okay, you guess. You must have been having fun. You're pretty sure, anyway. Alright, enough of that. Let's try to force our way past the blinders Bungie so carefully constructed around us and take a look at things other than what they put directly in front of our gun. Because Halo's a big game, right? There has to be a lot else to see. Halo's, at the time, immense levels and broad outdoor spaces suggest a freedom unlike what most people had experienced in a first-person shooter up until that point. I'll champion Unreal any day of the week and tell you all about its wide natural settings, but there's no denying that Halo's outdoor spaces are generally larger and certainly less angular. The vehicles, as well, when you're allowed to have them, reinforce that feeling of freedom. And yeah, you're free to go off in any direction you want. And find nothing. When you're going through a level, gameplay of course falls into that predictable 30-second loop I just talked about a bunch. You come across arenas filled with enemies, kill them, and walk away. While you're walking, someone on the radio talks at you a little bit, usually Cortana. If you're lucky, someone else calls in to talk to Cortana for a few lines, and by the time they're done talking, you've arrived at, or are nearby, the next combat arena. Nowhere in this loop does exploration come into play. Levels, big or small, might have various nooks and crannies you can travel to if you're lucky, but you're not gonna find anything there. This is made painfully obvious by the introduction to the game's second level. You've just crawled out of the crashed lifeboat and are taking in the wide open space. Not 30 seconds later, Cortana tells you it's time to stop dawdling and go somewhere else because a Covenant dropship's on its way.
Warning. I've detected multiple Covenant dropships on approach.
And sure enough, right afterwards, a ship comes down to deliver a group of enemies along with a banshee to harry you from above. This sucks. Everything about the visual presentation is telling you to take your time and look around. There's a broad field in front of you, a waterfall off in the distance, a towering cliff to peer down. Hey, is this just Nylev's Falls again? Trees and bushes and a wide open sky. But no. Stop looking. We're gonna dump some enemies on you because we're afraid you'll get bored. And you know the worst part? Even if you do get across the bridge, even if you do manage to make it over to the rocks Cortana talks about, that banshee knows where you are all the same, you can't escape it. And those enemies? Look through your pistol's scope and see that they're staring right back at you. Get close enough to the bridge again and they'll just start shooting. Cortana says they're gonna loot the crash site, but they don't have an animation for that or anything, they just stand there and look at you. Basically every enemy in this game either starts a combat encounter already aware of your presence, or is just standing around waiting for you to show up. Even if you do beat the group at the crash site, because honestly it's just more of what you just got done dealing with on the last level, there's nothing to find in this area. If you go over and look at the waterfall, you'll just be closer to the waterfall. There are no scattered items, special guns, or anything that gives you any amount of information about this new world you find yourself on. In Unreal, which I'm bringing up again because honestly the presentation of the two games' opening levels is very similar, the area you start the game proper in is absolutely filled with details. You see small huts belonging to the indigenous species. There are text logs by them and the crashed ship's crew, a small storage area belonging to the planet's alien conquerors, and even harmless critters running around. Put side by side, these opening levels and areas are pretty alike, but where Unreal wants to instantly draw you in and give you things to look at and think about, Halo is just so uninterested in exploring anything to do with itself. All you can do, upon seeing this wide open area, is move on, because you learn almost instantly that there's nothing in it. Halo's world does not want to have a conversation with you. It doesn't care about letting you find things to be interested in on your own. It wants to run up to you, shove a set piece in your face, then take it away before you have a chance to actually examine what you're looking at before doing the whole thing over again. It's a world that feels insecure, afraid that you'll notice how shallow it is, and doing everything in its power to stop you from finding out. And this is something that just gets more and more obvious the further along you go. It doesn't even matter if you ignored those enemies to give yourself the illusion of escaping them, because there's an identical group at the foot of the hill ahead of you. That leads you to a larger area where you meet the first group of Marines who have taken cover on something. It's a big angular structure that shoots a blue laser into the sky. There's no way into it, and there's nothing on the exterior. As far as the game's concerned, this is just a piece of geometry for you to put between yourselves and the enemies. Nobody even comments on it, despite the game setting itself up so far as something fairly narrative-driven with lots of NPCs talking at you. Not once does the conversation of what you're looking at come up. Not now, and not later. Of course, the Master Chief isn't allowed to talk outside of cutscenes, as we'll discuss later, but where's Cortana's little quip wondering what you're looking at? Where is it ever, as you're fighting across the landscape? They literally put a character in your head whose entire point is to tell you things, so why doesn't she? After Assault on the Control Room, she has knowledge of the Halo and all its systems, so why aren't we learning anything about it?
You can't imagine the wealth of information. The knowledge so much, so fast. It's glorious.
Before that, why isn't she telling us anything about the Covenant or making comments about the wealth of Forerunner stuff around? I understand that there's a level of not wanting to explain basic concepts of a setting to someone, the Master Chief in this case, who's supposed to already know about it. And that's a fair thing to consider when building a world. Why would people familiar with something need a lecture on it? But it goes both ways, because even though our player character already knows things, the player does not. You have to find a way to give that information anyway, either through direct conversation or strong context clues. Is this blue laser shooting structure a gun of some kind? Is it like a geyser that relieves pressure? Is it a signal beacon? Nobody inside the game asks. The game doesn't consider this important. That's establishing a theme. You do, in fact, end up inside one later in the same level, but it's just a series of ramps leading down into a room with 2 short bridges over a pit. There's nothing. Absolutely nothing in this building. But I get it, this is an alien superstructure. Of course, it's gonna have weird alien things on it without clear purpose. I'm okay not knowing everything about the setting the instant it comes up, but I'd like to come away from the entire game as a whole with something. But there just isn't. The setting of Halo is ignored so intensely by every single character inside of it that the player starts learning the same lesson. Eventually, all these random featureless structures just blend into a visual slurry, becoming simple geometry to navigate around instead of anything to wonder about. I've said before in other videos that I do honestly believe that little useless areas are important to building a believable world, and I'm not going back on that here. But when I say that, I'm talking about things that help build the character of the world, things that still have detail in them that feels natural, things that you would expect to see in a realistic, imperfect environment that help you forget you're just playing a video game. When you take some time to see what your coworker's having for lunch in Half-Life, or wander into an empty Nolly house in Unreal, you're experiencing a part of the world that still, ultimately matters, even if it's not part of the critical path. But those useless areas are supposed to be a sometimes food, a light sprinkling of seasoning to help draw out the real flavor. Good luck downing an entire bottle of cumin in one go. What does the 19th massive artificial cavern with nothing inside it tell us about Halo's setting? What details exist? What can we take away from it? There are other games where these questions don't necessarily need to be asked. Doom, which I've brought up now as a comparison multiple times, is plenty abstract and has never received this sort of questioning, nor do I think it should. That's because Doom never invites you to ask those things, while Halo does. Doom makes it clear by its writing and level design that any details you pick up about the world it's created are basically accidental. E1M1 fundamentally doesn't make sense as a real-world space, but it isn't trying to. It's a thin veneer on a gameplay arena designed to put demons in front of your gun, and it knows that. Some areas are more realistic than others, but the focus is never on that, and nothing about the game tries to convince you it is. Halo wants to convince you. Its presentation is screaming for you to pay attention to the world it creates, and when you do, or try to, you aren't given anything in return. Like the dog that caught the car, it never thought far enough ahead to figure out what it'll do with your attention once it has it. The game is trying, desperately, to get you to take it seriously as something beyond a series of levels to kill aliens in. That's why there are cutscenes and scripted music cues and named characters with voiced dialogue. If none of that were there, and the only introduction to Halo you got was a splash screen saying,
"Those Covenant bastards shot down your ride. Time to make them pay,"
this sort of level and environmental design would fly just fine. But you're told, almost begged, to expect more. I'm convinced that this is why people speak so highly of the level 343 Guilty Spark. It has, hands down, the best presentation of the entire game. It's still mostly just copy and pasted rooms and hallways, and that still sucks, but it's elevated by all the little details that simply don't exist anywhere else in the game. The makeshift barricades, the bullet holes, the general signs of struggle, the different levels of destruction that have been done to this underground facility. Even in the very beginning, just seeing Covenant forces running away, doing anything other than standing around waiting for you is novel and exciting. There's an identity built into the parts of the level that you just aren't given a glimpse of anywhere else. In games like Half-Life and Unreal, and even in earlier build engine games like Duke Nukem and Blood, one of the biggest focuses in their level design was making the areas you were in identifiable. You knew what kind of space you were currently inhabiting, whether that was a cafeteria, a bar, a movie theater, a mine, or anything in between or beyond. Halo makes no effort to contextualize the spaces you visit. You'll never learn the purpose of any area you're in, except the 2 times you're in the Pillar of Autumn, and even then only when you're in distinct rooms and not just more hallways. And sometimes you don't even get that much, like when you're in the barricade room, the room where they keep all the barricades. In Halo, there's nothing to learn about anything you see, if you even see it. So much of this game is blank, grey walls. You'll enter a vast, cavernous space and instantly know that there's no point looking around. Still keeping to level 2 for a moment, when you enter the cave that isn't a natural formation and find that huge expanse with a handful of enemies, it doesn't take long to realize that there's literally only one thing inside of it, the button that makes the bridge. All that space, all those obstacles, entirely useless. Walk in, walk up a ramp, press a button, leave. Even just getting to that point is the same story. You drive through these tunnels that are just a collection of 90-degree angles and 4-story high walls, and there's absolutely nothing to them. The complaint persists even when you get a brief look at the game's only Covenant-focused architecture. In Truth and Reconciliation, when you get into the ship, you're treated to 2 different identical hangars, a control room of some kind, and 2 different identical brigs. Everything in between is just blank hallways ending in 90-degree angles. To the level's credit, there are a small handful of locked doors we don't go through, so maybe more interesting stuff is through them, but you still get a mental map of these huge chunks of the ship that are just totally inaccessible. Where are the crew quarters, whatever passes for a mess hall, armories, maintenance bays, workshops? I'm not asking for a fully explorable ship here, I don't need the Rickenbacker, but give the player something that makes it feel like any effort at all was put into creating this space beyond exactly what was needed to be there for the level triggers to work. But it's just the same problem, the same question, over and over again. Where is the detail to this world? Halo does have a strong aesthetic identity, don't get me wrong, at least when it isn't just lifting directly from aliens. It's just that it actively refuses to let those aesthetics mean anything or otherwise create something beyond the surface level impact that geometry alone makes. And I ask, what's the point of strong aesthetics if you aren't using it to imply anything larger? In Halo, it's obvious that there's absolutely nothing beyond what you immediately see. There are no fake doors set into these walls to imply larger spaces beyond them. No windows into inaccessible areas that give an illusion of more. You know there isn't more. The mystery of Halo dies, because you learn very quickly that there are never going to be any answers. People like mysteries because it's a puzzle they get to solve. But a puzzle with no solution, a mystery with no resolution, is just wasting your time. And wasting time is about the only thing these areas could ever do, because even if you try to wring anything at all out of them, there isn't just nothing to find narratively, but there's nothing to find mechanically. In more traditional first-person shooters, exploring a level meant you could be rewarded with things tucked away out of sight for only the most discerning of players to find. You might be given a powerful weapon a number of levels earlier than the more obvious progression would have allowed, or find extra ammo for something whose use is usually more restricted. Maybe you find a strong armor pickup or something that pushes you over the maximum health limit. Halo has nothing. If you even manage to find somewhere off the beaten path, there won't be anything for you there. The game's arsenal is already so small that it can't afford to give you something ahead of when it wants to make its big introduction, and the adherence to diegetic item placement discourages it anyway. Why would a human rocket launcher be inside one of the weird structures? Having a shotgun going into the second half of Truth and Reconciliation would feel great, but where would you put it that it could make sense? And honestly, Given the game's 2-weapon limit, would finding a powerful weapon tucked away somewhere even feel good? Is it much of a reward if you have to drop something to pick it up? You haven't even gained anything at that point, and then it would just feel bad to use knowing you won't be able to keep it around for when you do get more ammo. If the ultimate resolution to going to the effort of finding a secret is to throw the reward away, what was the point in finding it? And maybe that's why there aren't any secrets, but it still feels bad knowing that no matter how large an area is, you're actively discouraged from exploring. To finally bring all this together, let me tell you about a segment in Assault on the Control Room and Two Betrayals Later that always stuck with me. You're going down the path, and you come into a large area with a massive stone tower in the center of it. There's a little room at the bottom with some guys to fight, including a surprise encounter with another invisible sword elite. In this room, mildly hidden behind some pipes, is an invisibility power-up. The room itself is fairly interesting. It's tall and weirdly shaped, and has a glass floor letting you see down into a deep pit, your eyes following a massive pair of pipes set against countless glowing lights. It's neat, I like this room. This is something Halo needed more of, a little space with just enough context to make you interested, something that you can latch onto and draw conclusions from. It's also optional, which makes fighting the uncommon enemy and getting the power-up feel cool. The invisibility is ultimately useless, unfortunately, given that you're in the middle of a vehicle-focused section, but it's still something to find, so points to Bungie for trying here. The thing is, when you're playing through this level backwards in Two Betrayals, you can visit this space again, except this time you have a Banshee. On top of this stone tower, hidden from view previously, is a little landing pad area and one notable feature, a small building. Inside this building, which also occupies a conspicuous metal chimney running down the entirety of the tower, is nothing at all. Literally just a cut-in of the floor. It clearly, so obviously clearly, leads down into the glass floor pipe room, but there's no way down or up. It feels like an elevator was supposed to be here and just didn't get put in. And it's so aggravating, because you know what? This would have made that invisibility power-up make sense. Go in, fight the Sword Elite, get the invisibility, take the elevator from the ground floor to the landing pad, and fight some more guys while you're invisible. A fun reward for exploration, even if you wouldn't get anything else out of it. And it wouldn't even let you sequence break or anything. They could have just not put the Banshees up there the first time around, and without them, you can't even get across to the little room where you overload the energy beam later. This isn't even a missed opportunity. This is an opportunity that was directly in front of them that they made a conscious effort to ignore. It's absolutely baffling. And it's just another way that so much of what Halo does becomes pure set dressing instead of anything substantial. Halo is equal parts derivative and unambitious, very clearly pointing to all its major inspirations, but utterly uninterested in trying to do anything with what it takes. It makes no effort to meld the various elements of itself into something new, instead just presenting them to you like mismatched toys in a bucket. It's a game that, examined as a whole, is far less than the sum of its parts. It's a fact that there's very little truly original in the world of fiction. Ideas spread and propagate, people think something's neat and want to do it themselves their own way, individual concepts travel from one point to another and mutate as they go. There's nothing wrong with this. A fundamental part of the act of creation, of being a creative person, is being able to take your inspirations from so many different sources, filter them through your own preferences, experiences, worldview, adding your own little twist to everything, and come up with something that's yours. Something that has your fingerprints on it. Something that's spoken with your own voice. It's also true that because of this personal lens everyone creates through, things that might be superficially similar are not identical deeper under the hood. After some incredibly brief research, I'm led to believe that the first formalized proposition of faster-than-light travel in fiction came from the Skylark of Space serials by E. Doc Smith, written in the early 1920s and published a few years later. If we latch on to this single point, we can smugly say that Star Trek is just ripping off Skylark, and, by extension, so is Halo. But that's dumb, nobody would say that. That would be like saying two wildly different properties are exactly the same because they both have dudes in power armor with big shoulder pads. I'm not going to sit here and try to pretend that I can point out each and every individual thing that Halo's lifting a little too eagerly. That kind of behavior ultimately doesn't accomplish anything and just leads to endless arguing over what is or isn't too close to a particular source that might not even be correct. But it's still worth nudging people's eyes towards them, I think. When you see where most of Halo's ideas came from, it becomes easier to realize how many gaps there are in its own presentation of them. I've mentioned Unreal a lot so far because I legitimately do see a lot of similarities between and imitations of that game, mainly in presentation and construction. StarCraft is a well they're sipping from here and will dip much deeper into next time, while you can pull up basically any scene from Aliens and go, hey, come on now. The setting alone is a clear pastiche of Larry Niven's Ringworld, but there are enough differences to keep the lawyers at bay, and certainly not even half the thought put in. Pulling from all of these sources would be fine, if it were done well. Halo isn't derivative because it's a clear mishmash of easily identifiable parts and ideas of other properties, it's derivative because it doesn't do anything with them. The world Halo creates becomes very small as a result, a world that can't answer questions about itself because nobody involved in its creation thought that hard about it. They were banking on their inspirations doing the heavy lifting. Where Unreal created a living, breathing world with history and clashing cultures, Halo created a desolate landscape that hurries you through because it knows it can't support close scrutiny. Where Aliens created a tactile look into a futuristic military and made you care about the characters inside of it, Halo dressed some mannequins in Spirit Halloween versions of their armor and tweaked the music a little bit. Where Ringworld created a complex superstructure and all the systems needed to support it, Halo stuck a big circle around a planet and hoped you were impressed enough to not ask questions. Rather than molding their influences into something new and original, Bungie cut out pictures of them from a magazine and tacked them to a piece of poster board to hang on their bedroom wall. It has all the same care and depth as an 8-year-old talking about what if Goku fought Voldemort on the Death Star. And once again, this wouldn't even necessarily be a problem if this is all Halo was trying to be. But it wants you to see it as more, it wants to be taken seriously as the first, asterisk, part of a sci-fi epic with deep implications and deeper mysteries. It wants these things, but it wants them without having to put any effort in. The setting of Halo sucks and doesn't make any effort to not suck. The empty levels should have been the warning sign because the game world at large shows exactly the same lack of consideration and planning. Even the existence of the titular Halo itself is never really justified, and it certainly isn't used in an interesting way. Why is this thing a habitable ecosystem in the first place? Isn't it a weapon meant to emit a sterilization pulse? How much planning and setup, not to mention raw power, had to have gone into creating and sustaining such a broad, livable space? Were the mountain ranges and oceans put into place intentionally, or did they accrete naturally somehow? Are there plate tectonics of some kind? Are they sculpted into the surface itself, like in Ringworld? Are there usable amounts of raw materials, or is any civilization that might arise there trapped in a Stone Age existence? Are there even civilizations on it? We don't see animals of any kind, let alone intelligent life that isn't part of the ongoing battle, but there are distinct roads and someone put garden lights up all over the place. If it's an ecosystem first, why is the death pulse centralized on it? If it's just an underground research lab for the flood organisms, why bother with the surface world at all? Why give them something to escape to? If it's to study their reaction to a living environment, then why does the sterilization pulse have a radius of 25,000 light-years? Wouldn't it be better to contain it to just clear the area so you can run another experiment? And why keep them around at all if you're already well aware of the rampant destructive power they have? If there's a good reason for any of this, are you gonna tell us? Now, to me, these seem like pretty reasonable questions any self-respecting writer should have had an answer for before pitching the idea to a publisher, or even starting the first draft. I'm jumping ahead a bit again, but some of these questions are answered in different ways across different games, so that's cool. They can't even keep the fundamentals of the setting straight between releases. That sure makes me want to care about things. Indulge me while I talk about Ringworld for a little bit. Ringworld is a 1970 science fiction novel by Larry Niven set in his known space universe, which is my personal favorite sci-fi setting. It's one of the best realized and most interesting settings I've ever experienced, and the sheer number and depth of the intricacies involved in some of its ideas are just so fun to learn about. Larry Niven is not a writer of the hardest science fiction you'll ever experience, but his books, and especially the earlier ones, are based in enough of reality that how he breaks certain rules is very interesting to see. Ringworld is one such thing. The book focuses on a small group of explorers as they embark on an expedition to the titular Ringworld, an incomprehensibly massive structure discovered somewhere deep in space. The moment-to-moment narrative of Ringworld is an admittedly somewhat simple adventure story. The cast comes across a circumstance, have to use either their brains or their brawn to maneuver through it, and come away having learned something from the experience. That's a simplification, to put it lightly, but I have a lot to say, and there are only so many details I'm willing to get bogged down in. The real meat of Ringworld comes from the structure itself. Between the first book and its 1980 sequel, The Ringworld Engineers, there's very little about this setting we don't learn either in detail or in passing. We learn its dimensions, we learn how it defends itself against asteroid impacts, how it deals with the ones that slip through and what happens when it can't. We learn how the ring keeps itself stable around the sun it orbits, how day and night are created, how travel from different sections of the structure works. We learn about how soil is replaced after being washed away into rivers and other bodies of water, since most of the larger landscape details are sculpted into the ring itself, and there are no natural methods actually available. We also learn what happens when those systems break down, both in terms of the environment and the civilizations living there affected by it. It always confused me that the Ark in Halo 3 had such a large desert included in it. On an artificial structure designed to harbor as much humanoid life as possible, why intentionally include an inhospitable environment? On the Ringworld, the existence of a desert was a marker that the environmental recycling systems had broken down, and was ultimately a clue at how bad things had gotten. As for the various species on the ring, we see how living there at all affects societies and religions and myths. As I mentioned previously, the fact that the landscape is sculpted into place means that there are barely any natural resources, no iron or copper or other metals, and certainly nothing like oil or uranium. What does that mean when the advanced race living on the ring loses access to their technology with no way to replace it? Well, guess what's a massive subplot of multiple books? And all of this was just a quick overview. Obviously, the books themselves go into far more detail a video game like Halo can't. And I'm not asking it to sit me down and lecture me on the exact orbital mechanics that lets this ring be parked around a planet. Oh, I don't know, there sure is a lot of water on the Halo. Is it balanced properly when it spins? That's not what I'm asking for. But it's clear, just by playing this game, that the setting doesn't matter. The habitable inside face of a giant ring was chosen because it looks good in the skybox, and sci-fi megastructures are cool. But isn't that disappointing to know that nobody was interested in asking those questions? Doesn't it feel a little bad to wander around this world and know that it's so shallow? So much care and attention went into considering the ring world, every single part of it, and Bungie was content to callously discard all that effort in order to sell a game on the back of a setting that looked neat. You don't come away from Halo, any of the games, knowing much more about the universe they take place in than when you started. You can infer via context clues at the start of the game that humanity is at war with the Covenant, but what does that information actually get you? There's nothing else to learn about that point in this game, not even by accident. The Covenant are obviously some conglomeration of at least 4 different races, but are there any other aliens? Neutral ones, friendly ones. The Pillar of Autumn seems to be all humans, so we must not have alien allies of any kind, or at least not here. But Cortana mentions the Forerunners very casually. Who are they? The Master Chief doesn't ask her to clarify who she's talking about, so maybe they're already a known factor. Captain Keyes and the Marines certainly never have anything to say about them either, so I guess they're not that important. If they were a big deal, surely being around this much random architecture of theirs should have been cause for some comments, right? Or is it really just that common? Do we see this stuff every day? Nobody ever seems excited about the Halo itself. An emergency, unplanned hyperspace jump took you directly to this thing, and you're just like, ah, cool, we can land on it. I get that there was kind of a situation going on at the time, but what, does everyone have one of these in their backyard? Cortana also mentioned that this ring was of religious significance to the Covenant, but we never see any real indication of that. They're more than willing to do as much damage to the place as we are. Surely firing off plasma artillery in your culture's equivalent of Vatican City is something that would give a staunch believer a bit of a pause. We never see any elites or grunts involved in any kind of rituals or prayer, and the comments made by our enemies that we can understand don't indicate any fear that we're desecrating or acting heretically. This whole religion angle would get a total overhaul in Halo 2, but that's not the game we're talking about here, and in this one, it's a bit of information that's totally inconsequential to what plot does manage to exist. Did you even remember that Halo 2's version of things was a literal total 180 on the single piece of information we get in this game? See my previous comment about the different games changing their answers. Another point that seems to get dropped in this game is that the human forces on the ring are in any way outmatched. The fact that survivors are scattered across some area is brought up in the second level and never again, and even then it's only within the space of, what, half a square mile? If there weren't hostile enemy forces around, they would have been able to meet up on foot in a couple minutes. And going forward, scattered Marines are never a concern ever again. Apparently that was all of them. I already talked about how Halo fails to give you any reasons to explore a level because its core systems aren't built to support any kind of reward, but imagine if you could find little groups of stranded friendlies throughout the entire game. Even if it's just one or two guys, that would be a tangible reward as well as an emotional one. You get extra firepower, and it feels good to help out. Halo admittedly did pretty okay with its friendly AI, and it likes to showcase them when it can, so why avoid opportunities to do so? The lack of any attention paid to this part of the story's setup also creates a weird miasma of questions hovering over the entire thing. If we're scattered and on the losing side of a skirmish spanning thousands of miles of this structure, why are we always so well equipped? There's always a dropship ready to pick us up and take us somewhere else, fuel never seems to be a concern, and we keep finding vehicles and powerful weapons all over the place. Where's this all coming from? Have the Marines found some central location to hole up in and turn into an operations center? Do we ever visit it? Did we tell them we were going to blow up the ring? Who's in charge of this clearly well-running logistical machine? We know it isn't the captain because he spends most of the game captured. Ask the same question of the Covenant. They're obviously more numerous, but it doesn't seem to matter much as far as their tactical preparations go. Sure, they'll have a handful of stationary turrets here and there, but nothing about the areas you visit suggests these guys have done anything to prepare for your arrival, even if they know you're coming. The soldiers on the Pillar of Autumn did a better job of preparing for an enemy incursion than the entire occupying force around the control room did, and the Covenant there had way longer to get themselves set up. We spent a long time in that level before finally making it to the structure itself. Surely someone was able to call ahead and tell them we were coming. But mechanically, we always seem to be on equal footing with them. There's no progression of difficulty as they're able to get more firmly entrenched than we are. Their supposedly superior numbers and technology never matter. We never see them in a way that makes it obvious. We never come across anything they have and go, "Ooh, that's scary." They have dropships flying around all over the place, so do we. They can bring out the big guns whenever they want, so can we. The imbalance is stated, but never seen. This isn't a case of show, don't tell. This is telling one thing and showing the complete opposite. Sure, you can turn the difficulty level up, but that's not what I mean. This is still a narrative issue. I mentioned it before, but the first time we come up against a Wraith, we're just instantly given the tools to deal with it. Where's the tension? Where's the dread in the face of a superior foe? If we're supposed to be so out of our element, why do we always have exactly what we need to keep it an even playing field? In video games, stuff like this is just as important a storytelling device as characters talking. Look at Half-Life's level Surface Tension, where the sudden freedom from a claustrophobic environment is cut short by a helicopter strafing the area. You have to spend a long time making your way through the various parts of the level before finally getting a rocket launcher and taking your revenge. Or you're supposed to, but in my recent playthrough, the helicopter just, left. Halo never lets you feel overwhelmed by the Covenant, so we must not be. We never get a sense that the human forces are struggling to find manpower or resources, so they must not be. We always have the best available options, and the Covenant threat never increases to counter it, so they must not be able to. It strips the conflict of any real depth and makes it hard to care about. It's an example of the power fantasy being too strong, to the point that it denies the narrative any actual bite. And wouldn't it feel better to be the super soldier overcoming deadly odds if you weren't handed so many obvious solutions? There's also just the simple fact that throughout all these levels, you have no real sense of where you are or where you've been. Beyond just failing to create environments that give you any clues about themselves, there's nothing about the way the game is structured that lets you look up at the arch of the ring in the skybox and trace your progress. Other than twice, where first your dropship pilot and later Cortana give you approximate distances to the next level's objective, you never know how far you've traveled or how long it's been between missions.
The Truth and Reconciliation touched down on a desert plateau roughly 300 kilometers upspin. She put down 1,200 kilometers upspin.
In Unreal, from the very first moment you step out onto Napali, you can see a very distinctive formation in the skybox. It isn't as pretty as anything in Halo's skybox, but it's noticeable all the same. It looms over the other mountains in the distance, drawing your attention to it with its distinct shape. As you progress, you feel like you're creeping closer and closer to whatever this is, until you're at its foot. This is the Sunspire, and now this thing that was following you through the entire game is now a full level for you to explore. Even before reaching it, you'll begin each level where you ended the previous one, creating a totally unbroken journey that you can think back on and use to visualize how far you've come. In Half-Life, the Black Mesa Research Facility is famously the same way. You start your day at work right at the front door and have a very weird shift afterwards, but you always know where your feet are taking you. Mostly. Anyway. Even Doom puts more effort into connecting its individual levels than Halo does, just by showing you a static theme park map and a "You Are Here" arrow. Halo isn't built to be a continuous, flowing experience like Unreal or Half-Life. And that's fine, but it's another way the narrative discourages you from getting invested. It wants to be a grand, sprawling story, but is trying to cram that into isolated episodic bursts. You can't ground yourself, you can't find a reference point for anything you've done. Why doesn't Halo use its high-resolution skyboxes to put previous locations or future destinations on the horizon? Why does no one tell you where you are or how long it's taken you to get there? Why is this game, why is Bungie so resistant to giving you any information at all about the world being created? The narrative and setting of Halo only seem to exist through your, the player character's, viewpoint. Off-screen, nothing's happening. This is not a world that continues without you or existed before you. And this is what I mean when I say there isn't anything to learn about the setting by trying to examine it. You can't go off into a level and find some weird thing that hints at the background of this place, because not even Bungie knew what it was. You can't find little spots that cause Cortana to spout some hidden voice line telling you something about how this place works, or at least what you're looking at. You can't look back at what's happened and see an evolving narrative. It's why they have to lead you by the nose through every level, because they know that if you stop and ask a single question about anything, you'll see the place falling apart behind you. But you know who isn't asking any questions? Our player character, the Master Chief. John Halo, to use his given name, is in a weird limbo, stuck between classic silent protagonist of the 90s and voiced military action hero of the 2000s. In cutscenes, he'll happily respond to the ongoing situation and sometimes even offer up some original thoughts of his own, but during gameplay, he's completely silent, even when addressed directly.
Good to see you, sir. Welcome to the party.
It's a mess, sir. We're scattered all over this valley. We called for evac, but until you showed up, I thought we were cooked.
This has the small and unfortunate side effect of ruining the entire story of the game. In a narrative-driven affair like this one, having your main character all but refuse to engage with the narrative is an odd choice. But it's the choice Halo makes, so we're stuck with the consequences. Consequences that only get larger and more obvious the longer the game, and the series as a whole, goes on. Now, to be perfectly fair, the problems don't really start until Assault on the Control Room, though arguments could be made for them beginning to show all the way back in Truth and Reconciliation. There, some well-timed questions about the layout of the ship aimed towards Cortana, our navigational AI who lives in our helmet, could have helped add a little bit of context to the area we were wandering through, though I've already covered how there wasn't much to talk about in the first place. Of course, there are countless situations where a single extra question or short line of dialogue could add so much to these games, but we can focus on some of that later. Right now, let's look at what's probably the absolute worst of it. In Assault on the Control Room, at the end, the Master Chief plugs Cortana into the computer and she starts freaking out about something. She won't tell us, and she urges us to hurry on to the next level to see if we can stop Captain Keyes from doing whatever he's trying to do. It's a big, exciting cliffhanger that makes the somber and eerie intro of 343 Guilty Spark all that much more tense. But you enter that level on a dropship, which means that, at some point, our hero needed to wait for it to arrive. The area outside the control room was clear, we made very sure of that, so it's reasonable to assume that the dropship could pick us up right there. We wouldn't have to spend time walking to it and could just wait around. Even 5 minutes of waiting would have been enough to go back in and ask for a more clear explanation. In fact, doesn't it seem that an inability to give clear, concise information in a high-pressure situation would be a very bad feature for a warship's AI to have? I think both of them are at fault here. But it gets much worse. Obviously, the Master Chief doesn't have anyone to talk to for the bulk of 343 Guilty Spark, but when the character the level is named after shows up at the end, there's a lot said that never gets addressed, and that's a trend that just keeps going. Our blinky blue friend the Monitor begins the library already chattering away about proper nouns and procedures we're apparently following, using some very eyebrow-raising language that implies he knows who we are and what we're doing here. This seems like something a reasonable person would ask about. And it's not like Guilty Spark is being cagey with this information. He's more than willing to talk about anything and everything related to the Flood. It's just that the Master Chief never once opens his mouth. What is the Flood doing here? Where did it come from? What can the Halo do to stop it? Wouldn't a career military man in the middle of a situation unlike anything anyone else has ever experienced want to gather a little information about everything that's going on? At least with truly silent protagonists, you can project qualities onto them. You can imagine certain things about them, fill in the intentional blanks with your own version of who Doomguy or Ranger or Gordon Freeman is. Other games with silent protagonists also tend to avoid putting their characters in positions where talking would solve literally everything. Even though Half-Life has just as many NPCs gabbing to Gordon as this game has chatting up the Chief, it makes an effort to head off any comments the real-world you might have about a situation. Gordon's silence isn't an oversight, it's a part of his character that others around him play off of and were written around.
Now, if you follow standard insertion procedures, everything will be fine.
I don't know how you can say that, although I will admit that the possibility of a resonance cascade scenario is extremely unlikely.
Gordon doesn't need to hear all this. He's a highly trained professional.
Yes, you're right. Gordon, we have complete confidence in you.
Well, go ahead. Let's let him in now.
This is Echo 419. Chief, is that you? I lost your signal when you disappeared inside the structure. What's going on down there? I'm tracking movement all over the place.
But the Master Chief doesn't have that luxury, because as soon as a cutscene starts, he has a voice and a personality, thin as it is, that has to come into play. Suddenly he's part of the story again, where outside of a cutscene, all he can do is watch the pages of the script turn. You're left waiting for him to talk, to ask a question, because you know he can. It seems like multiple parts of this game's story would have happened differently if there had just been a cutscene going on at the time, because then our protagonist would have been graciously allowed to exhibit the slightest amount of agency. Hey, Echo 419 sounds pretty concerned. Do you maybe want to, respond to her at all? Relay any information about the events that just happened? Warn someone? I don't know why she sounds so concerned at the end of the level. Him not responding is just par for the course, really.
Chief, I've lost your signal. Where'd you go? Chief! Chief!
The Master Chief also never asks about a single thing 343 Guilty Spark says when they're running around the library. He hears comments about the efficiency of his weapons, the effective level of his combat armor, procedures he's supposed to know about, and doesn't react. When you get to the end of the level and Guilty Spark says we can retrieve the index, why do we want it? What even is it? What will picking it up allow us to do? Why are we being trusted with it? Silence. Utter silence. But as soon as you get back to the control room in Two Betrayals, he's more than willing to come to the little floating dude's defense and talk all about this great plan to activate the Halo and kill the Flood. Which, remember, was never a topic of conversation he and Cortana shared. She obviously learned about them when she got plugged in, but they haven't discussed a single thing about what happened between then and now. A time period of 12 hours, apparently, somehow. We saw every minute of those 2 levels, and while I know the library feels like it goes on forever, it was not 12 entire hours. But Bungie's loose grip on how time works aside, nowhere during those 12 hours did the Master Chief ask anything. Were we in the dropship for most of it? It's made so much worse as the opening cutscene of Two Betrayals goes along. What were slight hints earlier in the library become full-on text now. Apparently Guilty Spark has, or thinks he has, some former rapport with the Master Chief, addressing conversations they had some nebulous time in the past. Was it somewhere in those 12 hours? Why is he saying these things? What does he mean by any of this? Why aren't we asking these questions? The Master Chief is an idiot, plain and simple. It literally takes an entire other character demanding it that he asks one question.
Is it true?
And the answer, again, is willingly given in perfectly plain English. It's not like we were trying to match wits with someone hiding just enough information to avoid giving us the full picture. The Master Chief apparently just wasn't interested in anything going on around him. He implicitly believed everything Guilty Spark told him since he was so willing to come to the Monitor's defense in that little exchange, but he never asked for clarification on a single matter. This guy sucks, and he doesn't get much better. Beyond even the specific examples, Bungie just does a bad job of actually characterizing him at all. You never get a sense of who this guy is or how he acts. Do the old test. From just the events of Halo 1, this game alone, describe the Master Chief without mentioning his outfit or his profession. Can you? He has all of, 4 verbal exchanges with Cortana, the main supporting character throughout the entire game, and one final one as the credits are about to start. 2 are playful? Is he playful? But they come at the very beginning and end of the game, hours apart, and with nothing in between. She's talking to him all game long, but he just doesn't have anything to say back. So he's also rude? This isn't exactly a buddy cop situation where they get to know each other better over the course of things. They start the game being co-workers who seem to be on amiable speaking terms and end the same way. I mean, sure, this doesn't need to turn into a love story or anything, though that might be a hilarious concept, but it's yet more cases where any opportunity to develop these characters, this character, the main one, the guy on the cover, is ignored. Just like the Halo itself, you don't come away from this game knowing anything more about the Master Chief that you didn't already know coming in. Who is the Master Chief? He's green.
What is it? Well, it's
Green, sir.
Oh, and speaking of the Flood, look, there they are right now. You might have noticed that I haven't mentioned the Flood in any real amount of detail yet. That's because, just like the game, I was saving them for a surprise reveal later in the narrative. And now that we're at a dramatically appropriate juncture, I'll spring them on you. The Flood ruin every single part of this game that is otherwise good and make the bad parts that much worse. Their inclusion is a domino chain of bad ideas in every category we've discussed so far. They introduce problems the game fundamentally wasn't built to handle and turn the otherwise fine if unexciting combat loop into an aggravating slog. They throw everything about the game's design philosophy out the window. They introduce story elements that make no sense here and never will in any of the other games. They let Bungie be lazy. The strength of the presentation and the level where the Flood are introduced has historically done a decent job of covering for just what exactly we're introduced to. In 343 Guilty Spark, you're put up against the little swarms of infection forms, a melee combat form, and a ranged combat form. But hold that thought. Let's rewind a little bit and turn our focus back to the Covenant and how they act in combat. Halo often gets praised for its enemy AI, and while I personally will always be willing to be a pedant and say that Unreal's enemy AI was far more advanced, reactive, and interesting 3 years earlier, I will also concede that yes, the elites do an okay job of moving around, avoiding grenades, and ducking in and out of cover. Grunts and Jackals, similarly, have their own way of meeting the threat that you pose. Both will break and run if you get too close, but the Jackals will take advantage of their shields to absorb some fire, while the Grunts will scatter as soon as they start taking damage, or their babysitter dies. Elites, though, will square up and try to beat you to death with their weapons, the same way your own melee attacks work. Other than the ones with swords, though, they never seek out melee combat. In the face of my complaints about how fighting the Covenant only has so many options that quickly get exhausted, it might seem like the Flood is exactly the sort of shakeup I was asking for. Introducing an entire second enemy faction with just as many options to fight as the first is good, right? On paper, sure. In practice, though, it becomes clear that the systems in place just don't work with what the Flood bring along with them. All the Flood want to do is run at you. Even the ones with guns will charge if you get close, and they're all very good at it. The entire faction is faster and more maneuverable than you. If a group of Flood are charging you, there's only so much running backwards you can do before they catch up. And while the groups of infection forms aren't too much of a threat unless your shields are down, they're not a threat you can ignore. Melee forms leap from halfway across a room and break your shields in 2 or 3 quick hits, and they never come alone. Ranged forms fire at you from a dozen different angles, and the whole thing quickly becomes chaos. Target prioritization becomes absolutely useless, as there are so many targets that all look so similar that trying to pick out individual threats is a waste of your time. Of course, you might say this is fitting, given the name. It is absolutely an unending tide of mutated meat, and I do in fact know people who love fighting the Flood. And all of this might even be defendable under the label of personal preference. But then, they give them shotguns. The fact that the Flood have access to the same human arsenal you do, filled with hit-scan weapons as it is, means the entire design philosophy of this game's combat goes right out the window. Everything I praised before about how you and enemies have fundamentally different ways of interacting with each other, how that lets you make decisions while fighting, how it builds tension as your resources slowly dwindle or makes you feel powerful for successfully avoiding more permanent damage, is gone. Just totally evaporates. Up until now, you haven't seen a shotgun in this game. The first time you do, it might very well be because you just got one shot with it after turning a corner. While Halo's encounter design might have been effective but boring up until now, having access to the Flood lets Bungie be lazy and sadistic. Drop a bunch of melee enemies in a room, scatter some ranged guys with assault rifles and shotguns around, and boom, another square room's taken care of. I bet they were just knocking these out by the dozen at this point, getting the entire back half of the game populated before lunchtime. And I do mean drop enemies on you, because the introduction of the Flood also marks the end of any attempt at clever enemy placement. Now they can just have them spawn infinitely from vents or from around corners. Oh, sure, you can say it's flavorful, they've infected the place, they're in the damn walls, man! But you also have to realize that it's just uncreative. The first time you get introduced to the carrier forms, these little inflated trash bags that explode at you and let loose a small handful of infectors, it's by walking past a piece of geometry and having one blow up in your face. And that's basically how they get used for the rest of the game, placed around corners to do damage to you before you have a chance to react. And this is where the hit scan issue comes back into play. It's bad enough in the close confines of 343 Guilty Spark, but when you're in the cavernous hallways of the library, all your options for avoiding damage are gone. Now your enemies have pistols and assault rifles, and no matter how far away from them you are, they will be doing damage to you. And when they're given rocket launchers, given the visual muck that is their design, you won't know about it until an explosion goes off. With luck, it won't be directly under your feet. Like the Flood, or hate them the way I do, it's hard to deny that they simply don't fit with the way the rest of the game works. Fighting Flood never feels like making intentional progress. It's always a mad dash to the next checkpoint, resigning yourself to the many deaths along the way. Oh, the checkpoint system. Yeah, Halo doesn't use user-directed saves, but neither does it make you restart the entire level if you die. There are checkpoints built into certain milestones inside the level, and a system in place to dynamically create others. These tend to kick in when the game considers you safe, not near enemies and not taking fire. Guess what the Flood ruin? Because there are so many of them, because they move faster than you, because they have ways of dealing damage to you no matter where you are, it's rare for the game to consider you safe when fighting them. This means that you're largely stuck with a level's own pre-placed checkpoints, and any progress you make between giant waves of enemies is pretty easily snatched away. I don't really have much more to say about it, but it just feels bad, especially knowing what you'll be up against again and again. Something people like to bring up, have brought up to me when I've presented these criticisms before, is how cool it is to see the Flood and the Covenant forces fighting. And you know what? Shut up. We all love monster infighting. It's always great when enemies can do damage to each other, and even better when they react to that damage and start wailing on whoever attacked them. It's fun to see. Once you start going back through the canyons and two betrayals, you see Flood and Covenant forces going to town on each other, just these big brawls and all-out battles. Good stuff, right? We love some monster infighting. Except that when you get close, all eyes turn to you. A combat form will let an elite's head fall right out of its mouth as soon as you walk by, and the elite will pick up his fallen plasma rifle and point it directly at you. The infighting is only saved from being a complete sham by the fact that they do actually deal damage to each other. Looking at you, Doom Eternal. It gets even worse in the level keys, where pairs of hunters will stop what they're doing while actively in the middle of dozens of Flood to start blasting at you as soon as you come around the corner. So no, I don't have to admit it's cool when they fight each other, it's just more stuff to deal with. It's miserable. The Flood also dig the deepest holes in this game's plot and the entire trilogy at large. I've already touched on some story concerns related to them by this point, so I'll try not to retread that ground, but it needs to be highlighted just how poorly thought out their inclusion is. The writers make no effort whatsoever to explain or excuse the Flood's presence in this story, and it only gets worse and more incomprehensible. Again, I'm okay with wanting to present an unknowable alien thing, but when you spend so much time focusing on it, eventually people are going to want some answers. And just like I mentioned before, nobody in this story seems interested at all in what's going on. The Flood are introduced, but by the time we catch back up to Cortana, it seems like she's already well aware of them. Well, sure, she was in the computer. Could she tell us anything about them, maybe? If this is a research installation, could we grab some of that research? Guilty Spark tells us how easy it is for them to infect things, but not what they are or where they came from, even though he clearly knows. This is why I've avoided talking about the story specifically for this long. It just leads to so many heaping piles of questions, and not the fun way a story should, where you're invested in asking things because you want to know more, but the bad way, where you're confused and asking these things because you literally have no information. Coming to the story section now, after all I've already said, feels a little weird, doesn't it? So much of what I've focused on so far has been built on the idea that the story doesn't support the world and vice versa. I've already focused on a lot of my complaints with this narrative over the course of other sections. What is there left to say, really? What haven't I already touched on, at least in some way? Ha! Plenty! Halo is a game written by the seat of its pants, just so clearly lacking in any sort of coherent plan that it can't keep itself straight. It does, admittedly, start out pretty okay, but it doesn't take long for the train to start wobbling, eager to hop the tracks. Playing these games and trying to pay attention to them, you'll come to realize something, really the key to this whole criticism. Bungie are terrible at conveying information. They're just bad storytellers, that's all there is to it. They build mysteries with no answer and then forget about them. They introduce shocking twist events into a storyline that didn't exist until just that moment. They'll spend over 30 years drip-feeding a loyal fanbase clues to a story that will never end, will never have a resolution, because nobody involved with it remembers where it was supposed to go, if it ever had a destination. I honestly didn't want to mention it at all, but I have to, because otherwise someone will be smug at me in the comments, and I'd hate to give them that chance. This game was supposed to be a follow-up to Bungie's previous series, Marathon. That's a known fact. It didn't end up that way, at least not officially, but it was conceived as such. So of course, Halo's story was supposed to be a continuation of Marathon Infinity's endless time loop alternate reality nonsense. Of course, that's what Guilty Spark is talking about. Of course, that's what the Gravemind will be talking about in the next game. Of course, that's what the terminals in Halo 3 are referring to. I get it. And it's all very stupid. In this game, in Halo, none of that matters. It didn't turn out that way. I beg you, rip the red yarn off your corkboard and focus on this game. Divorced from all the little threads that might possibly, sort of, probably, almost half imply a connection to this one sentence from Marathon when you read it backwards, Halo's story sucks. It's a basic adventure story that gets so bogged down in trying to imply larger things it forgets to put anything behind the curtain. Compare it again to Ringworld's basic adventure premise, where those episodic incidents are used to dive deeper into the setting as things go along. I've spoken at length about how bad this game is at giving you details to care about. We don't need to retread that. But when it does give you details, when Bungie remember they're supposed to be telling you things, half the time they either contradict it later or outright forget they said it. In the early stages of the second level, Cortana comments that the Covenant BattleNet is wide open, and she's been free to monitor their communications.
I've hacked into the Covenant BattleNet. They're actually broadcasting tactical data on unencrypted channels. We should show them who they're dealing with. Master Chief, I'm going to use your suit's transcom system to monitor their chatter.
She then tells us that the aliens have located the Pillar of Autumn's crash site and captured the crew, including Captain Keyes.
Warning, I picked up reports that the Covenant has located and secured the Pillar of Autumn's crash site. The good news is the Captain is still alive. The bad news is that the Covenant have captured the entire surviving command crew.
Way later in the 8th level, Cortana tells us her plan to detonate the Pillar of Autumn's engines to hopefully destroy the Halo. If only she knew where the ship was.
We need to trigger a detonation on a large scale, however. A starship's fusion reactors going critical would do the job. I'm going to search what's left of the Covenant BattleNet and see if I can locate the Pillar of Autumn's crash site.
What? How doesn't she know where it is? The Covenant were talking about it on an unsecured channel, and even if, somehow, they didn't say where they were going, you rescue Captain Keyes. You meet him in person. Why didn't he tell you where the ship was? He landed it. That was an entire thing in the first level. Between Truth and Reconciliation and the Silent Cryptographer, enough time passes for you to ditch the Covenant dropship you stole and meet back up with Echo 419. What happened between those levels? How much time, how many miles went by? Where did Keyes take us? How did we get separated from him again? He told us to keep Cortana safe, and just reprimanded us for coming to rescue him, so why did we run off into more danger? They don't tell us, because nothing in this world can happen off-screen. Every character and event only exists directly inside the tiny little envelope of time each level corresponds to. It's our own Marathon-style series of pocket dimensions. Characters and events are remade at the beginning of each level so they fit inside whatever new, slightly changed version of the story we're being dragged through. As soon as they're not on screen, they don't exist. These aren't characters, they're toys to be put away until it's time to play again. They sit in the dark, lifeless, until we pick them back up and assign them new goals and personalities. They're not the same as the last time we saw them, not because anything happened when we weren't looking that changed them, but because the script needs them to be that little bit different. Cortana doesn't know where the ship is because the script needs to add a tiny spike of uncertainty into the plan the new version of the story suddenly revolves around. Keyes never told us because he ceased to exist as soon as the loading screen kicked in at the end of the 3rd level. And then, a couple minutes after saying she still has no idea where the ship is, Cortana announces she found it.
I've located the Pillar of Autumn.
What did she do differently between then and now? She had just spent 12 hours plugged into the main control room of the entire structure. What does being back inside the Master Chief's helmet offer her that the combined sensor data of the whole ring doesn't? It's not like she can't interface with the computers, she clearly can. And Two Betrayals just keeps giving, really it does. In the opening cutscene, Guilty Spark tells you that the Halo's weapon has a radius of 25,000 light-years.
This installation's pulse has a maximum effective radius of 25,000 light-years.
Not 2 minutes later, again, Cortana says she has no idea what the range of the Halo's weapon is.
I can't even begin to calculate the pulse's range.
Why does nobody in this game pay attention to anything? And this isn't the last time Cortana will forget information presented less than 10 minutes previous. In the final level, the Maw, after Guilty Spark interrupts the Pillar of Autumn's self-destruct timer, she says we can detonate the engines manually by damaging them in a way that will cause a wildcat explosion. Her words, wildcat explosion.
That should be enough to trigger a wildcat explosion of the engines.
After we do this, Echo 419 gets back in contact with us, and Cortana, in her infinite wisdom, begins freaking out about how the damage to the engines must be more severe than she planned because a wildcat explosion is imminent.
Negative. We have a wildcat destabilization of the ship's fusion core. The engines must have sustained more damage than we thought.
It was her idea! How did she forget? Cortana alone is such a source of frustration in this game. I said way back before, but for a navigational AI who lives inside our head, she sure isn't interested in giving us information about the locations we visit. And I get that she's just as in the dark about this ring specifically as we are, and wouldn't it be funny if she somehow wasn't? But she's still willing to theorize and speculate in other circumstances, so why isn't she being used to tell us things?
The weather patterns here seem natural, not artificial. I wonder if the ring's environment systems are malfunctioning, or if the designers wanted the installation to have inclement weather.
I go back again to her refusal to tell us what we're walking into in 343 Guilty Spark. She knows. The cutscene tells us she knows what the Covenant found in that facility, and what Keyes is about to find, but she doesn't tell us. I said all this before, but it bears repeating now. Cortana sucks. I hate her. She also seems ridiculously impulsive. The whole plan to blow up the Halo comes out of nowhere, just emerges fully formed from her holographic brain in an instant. There was no lead up to it. Like, sure, Guilty Spark turned on us when we wouldn't engage with his Marathon AU coffee shop fanfic, but just fighting him doesn't cross anyone's mind as an option. He's already said that he can't fire the ring himself even if he did have the index, which he doesn't because Cortana stole it. He says he'll find another, but if he's talking about getting another human to do it, we could just tell the Marines on the ring not to listen to him. I mean, we don't seem to have any problem getting in touch with them whenever we need to. And even if he did manage to get some random other guy to listen to him, some other random guy who would also have to not ask the same questions we didn't ask, he still can't do anything without the index. It's why he says he needs our head, because that's where Cortana lives. Cortana, who has the index for the Halo, that index. Even if his plan otherwise goes perfectly, he'll still need Cortana, which means that he'll have to keep coming after us. Why don't we just shoot him? Spoilers, but it works just fine later. Cortana isn't the only impulsive one though. Captain Keyes is just as guilty. When we rescue him, he and Cortana both exposit that by information they learned off-screen from the Covenant, the Halo is a weapon. I guess things are allowed to happen off-screen after all, just as long as they let characters make stupid decisions. Keyes just instantly snaps to the idea that this means they'll use it to wipe out all of humanity, which begins our quest for the control room in the first place. One question, though. If the Covenant knew about the Halo, and could, in fact, use it to wipe out all of humanity, why haven't they? Again, we don't know why this war started or how long it's been going on, at least not from anything the game itself tells us, but this specifically seems to imply that the war only started right before we got here, if the Covenant want us dead but didn't have a reason to use the machine that kills humans. Wouldn't it be weird if we'd somehow been at war for like 30 years or something, and the Covenant just never remembered to use their I win button? So either it's an instant win device the Covenant are too stupid to have used before, or Keyes just made something up on the spot. But I guess actually the weapon the Covenant thought it was really the Flood? but then it was also an instant death pulse anyway. And that's not even taking the next game into account, geez. And like, we go on to learn that only a human can activate it anyway, so the Covenant having control of the Halo is a total non-issue. And once again, I find myself stuck on single-point complaints just because there are so many. But Halo's story is bad for much deeper structural reasons. The endless collection of single points doesn't help, but they're all just errant bits of flashing on a much worse overall product from a bad mold. I said before, but everything actually starts off just fine. The setup of appearing at some weird structure, the aliens following and attacking us escaping to the surface, collecting scattered allies, and rescuing the captain, this is a strong first act. Mechanical gameplay issues aside, nothing is wrong with this narrative in the first 3 levels. But going forward, it's all over the place. Again, Captain Keyes has just suddenly decided that the Halo is a weapon the Covenant will use to win the war, and has heard tell of a control room. Sure, whatever. It's a bit weak as far as justification goes, but we'll work with it. Act 2 begins with us already on our way to something that will tell us where the control room is. Hang on, there's a step missing here. When did we learn about this map room, or where it was? And why couldn't we have learned about the location of the control room the same way? But okay, whatever, you can call that a minor nitpick if you want. Structurally, Act 2 also begins just fine, and it seems like the rest is set up pretty nicely after it. Find the map room to find the control room, go there, stop the Covenant from activating the Halo, beat the game. So this level ends with us knowing exactly where the control room is and on our way to it. Okay, wait. That's not how this usually works. If you set up the entire next stretch of your story, don't then immediately resolve it. You guys caught that, right? Like, Silent Cartographer is all of Act 2, the search for the control room, and then Assault on the Control Room is all of Act 3, getting there. What just happened? The first 3 levels presented a very smooth progression of events, culminating in a reveal of the next larger threat. It worked. It seemed like we were on our way to another 2 or 3 maps that would end with us learning where the control room was, and then the last part of the game would be stopping the imminent danger. But instead, all of that is squashed down into the very next 2 levels, and you know why? Because Bungie just thought of this cool new story all about the Flood! Suddenly, the threat of the Covenant activating the Halo is gone. The entire setup to the game's second act is brutally chopped from the story to make way for this new thing. And now it's like we're in the second act of an entirely different story, one whose setup doesn't align in any way with what we've just played. Guilty Spark and the Master Chief are best friends playing off a first act setup that doesn't exist. And the game just continues from this new reality. Cortana seems to have shunted along with us. She knows all about the Monitor, and they're monologuing at each other like old enemies. Every part of the story is different now. The Covenant are only still in the game because Bungie has their models on hand. They don't have any narrative relevance past Assault on the Control Room. Act 2, or is it 4? Becomes all about the Flood, being introduced to them in 343 Guilty Spark and then fighting them in the library. And then the game's real final act is about getting back to Keyes to blow up the Pillar of Autumn. I guess it's also kind of fitting that the Flood suddenly and violently take over this game's plot, but looking at the entire story as a whole, it's a little confusing, right? The game sets everything up, we do an incredibly truncated version of it, effectively ending the story, and then it just pivots for no reason into an entirely different second thing. The introduction of the Flood doesn't feel, in any way, like a natural extension of anything that happened before it. Why is Keyes even out there in the middle of nowhere? He said we needed to find the control room, and we did. Why isn't he there with us, or back at the ship overseeing repairs? If Silent Cartographer and Assault on the Control Room had never happened, if we'd just gone straight from flying the stolen dropship away to, say, crash landing in the swamp after taking fire, the narrative would have ended up in the exact same place. It's another limitation Bungie's cornered themselves with, either accidentally or entirely on purpose. They set out to make a game where each mission was its own little episode. You get one stated goal at the beginning, go do it, and that's the end. Stringing a larger narrative out of it worked for 3 levels because they weren't trying to fit anything huge into these little boxes. But as soon as they want to ramp things up, they can't. They don't have room for it. A level has to have one plot point, and a plot point has to have one level. That's what they went into making this game constraining themselves to. It's a stylistic choice they made that almost instantly kneecaps them. They can't have you fight all the way to the control room and then stop to load an entirely new level. They have to put everything in one place. So that's why the entire control room, this massive structure, is an L-shaped hallway in one computer terminal. In games like Half-Life and Unreal, which I haven't talked about in a while, so I think I'm due, you'll finish up one area, open a door or turn a corner, and suddenly be loading the next. It's not temporally seamless, but it sure is narratively. These games have an actual opportunity to maintain a running theme between levels because nothing's forcing them to finish everything up all at once. And even then, you still get large individual chunks and set pieces, it's just that they're allowed to exist next to each other organically. The truth is, Halo never had a chance of telling the story it wanted to. It simply wasn't built to be able to do it. Despite its massive areas, nothing in Halo can be as big as something like the Black Mesa Research Facility, physically or narratively. So where does this leave us? We've got a story that seems to flicker in and out of existence, goals that change at the drop of a hat, and no real basis for what actually matters. We're more than willing to believe that sure, the Halo is a weapon that will delete humanity if only the Covenant use it. Then, when the Master Chief comes back from the library, we're all in on destroying the Flood, which nobody had any spoken opinions on until that very moment. A couple minutes later, we go to Operation Mordor to destroy the Ring. Calm down! Please, can anyone tell me what the actual priorities are here? This is like 3 first drafts all at once. Maybe it was. Quite famously, Halo was originally going to be an RTS for the Macintosh. Then it turned into a third-person shooter, and then a first-person one. It was supposed to be a far larger, more open world, filled with herds of endemic wildlife. The E3 reveal trailer shows the Master Chief triumphantly cresting a hill, holding an energy sword. That all vanished. At some point during the entire process, Microsoft acquired Bungie and told them to redo everything for the Xbox. I'm sure someone out there still knows what this game was originally supposed to be, how it was all originally supposed to come together. But it didn't happen that way. Microsoft wanted a killer app for their new toy going up against Sony and Nintendo. As far as the numbers are concerned, it paid off. Halo may have been a fractured, unfinished mess filled with ideas not even half-baked, but it was a slick shooter you could play in your living room. It was a mediocre product elevated by being alone in the ecosystem. Its flaws were ignorable because what else were you going to turn to? Flaws like replaying half the game in reverse. It's difficult to talk about all of Halo without mentioning that it's really just half of Halo twice. I should be commended for my restraint. You get a glimpse of it early in the Pillar of Autumn, going from the cryo chamber to the bridge, then all the way back again through those bland, empty hallways and 90-degree turns until you reach the escape pods. But then the wide-open expanses of the second level, Halo, ease your concerns. They just wanted to give you a thorough look at the last truly familiar-feeling location you'll see. Then the Covenant ship in Truth and Reconciliation does it again. You start in a hangar, travel to the brig, and end up in a hangar, all the way back through those bland, empty hallways and 90-degree turns until you reach the dropship. But then the wide-open expanses of the Silent Cartographer ease your concerns, until you realize that both times you go to a distinct location, you end up coming back out of them the same way, the enemies having repopulated when you weren't looking. Assault in the control room seems to break the mold, at least during the outdoor segments. You start off the level in pretty dire straits, straight hallways that is, and then you just run through the same room over and over again, interspersed with bland empty hallways and 90-degree turns. Then the high watermark of presentation that is 343 Guilty Spark feels like the game finally settling into its own element, until you find yourself going through those identical boxy rooms and bland empty hallways and 90-degree turns until you make it back outside. The library shows you one bland empty hallway and asks you to fight your way down it something like 4 dozen times, just seeing the exact same architecture over and over again. Not even changing floors introduces anything new. And 2 Betrayals is where the sinking feeling should be fully established. This is an entire level done backwards. Keys, too, is the same Covenant ship layout repeated, this time with extra arenas cosplaying as outdoor spaces. And the final level, the Maw, it's just the Pillar of Autumn again. To the bridge and back away one last time, at least to somewhere we haven't seen. Maybe I shouldn't have been so eager for something new, though, because from here it's to a truly baffling piece of architecture. A 3.5-kilometer-long rally track built into the top of the ship, complete with rooms large enough to build an entire city in, and giant gaping holes that would lead straight out into space if this ship wasn't crashed. There's a bridge out here, too, an open-air bridge on a spaceship. I guess we have to see Echo 419 get shot down somehow, right? What exactly is this place? Why did they build it like this? Why are these ramps so steep? Why are these rooms so massive? If this is a maintenance access passage, where are all the doors to access things? Personally, I've always figured this was an enrichment course to keep the ship's crew from getting bored on long deployments, but really it's just an easy way for Bungie to crassly manufacture a sense of excitement that the game lost somewhere around the library, if it ever had it at all. Yeah, they called him Captain Keys, because that's what they have to jingle in front of your face to get you to stop paying attention to the fact that this game is barely holding itself together. Playing Halo can really feel like a chore. It's hard to get a sense of progression when the level all but refuses to change around you, just showing you the same architecture for 20 straight minutes. It's bad. It's inexcusably bad. The fact that this game got this popular with level design this bad, this low effort, makes me feel insane. Look at the engine room, it's not even fully textured. We all played the same game, right? I haven't been cursed by a wizard to experience a fundamentally different version of Halo than literally everyone else who ever played it, have I? How did this get a pass? How wasn't this torn apart on release? Look, level design is hard. I get it. I've done some of it myself. Getting everything right takes time and a lot of iterations. It's a skill that needs to be practiced to be able to create good levels. But you absolutely do not have to be an expert to know that this is amateur work. No, sorry, that's insulting to someone who might actually be an amateur who's trying to learn something. This is work from someone trying to get fired. Glowing arrows on the floor, the same room a dozen times in a row. How many seconds before going gold was this level finished? Is that why that elevator that's obviously supposed to be there doesn't exist? What was it, do you think? Did they not have enough time? Did the project get shuffled around and restarted so much that the people left working on its final iteration didn't care? Was it a failure of management, or were the artists and writers and designers really just this inattentive? I'm not trying to call anyone out, at least not other than Bungie as a whole circa 2001, but this is a bad product. I mean, it works well enough, and it looks fairly nice, the animations are good, guns feel nice to use, music's okay, at least the more original stuff, and despite the times the game plays its most bombastic tracks when you're just walking up some empty hallways. Odd choice. But how was this good enough? Were console players really this desperate for a game other than GoldenEye? Did we really let this cobbled together mess dominate trends in gaming until, now? Halo's legacy is undeniable, but I just want to know how. Now I'll admit, I never had an Xbox, so I didn't experience this game alone in its own pond. But I did play it in 2003 when it was ported to the computer. And even as a kid, I didn't like the campaign, but I didn't have the words or experiences to articulate why, so this video really is a project over 20 years in the making. That's normal, right? I will say though, its multiplayer was a real good time. In fact, I'd go so far as to call it the best multiplayer shooter that Gearbox Software ever made. Halo's multiplayer is almost a separate legacy entirely of its own. Mention Halo in any online space and you'll be overwhelmed with responses from people wistfully remembering long nights spent playing split-screen in their parents' basements as children, or system linking across dorm rooms as young adults in college. And Halo's multiplayer was pretty fun. I played a lot of it myself at the time, and I was happy to revisit it when the Master Chief Collection released on PC. The thing is, though, I was a little disappointed when I got to play it again, because it wasn't quite how I remembered. And it wasn't just nostalgia playing its tricks. Things had changed. Things had been changed. Bungie's version of Halo's multiplayer is quite ground-focused, keeping you confined to pretty tiny maps and giving everyone hit-scan weapons. And of course, this is Halo, you move slowly and jump slower. You don't actually have very many options in a gunfight, so combat tends to devolve into people wheeling around each other, trying to be close enough to punch them once their shields are broken. The shotgun, plasma rifle, and needler are generally in one or two places on a map for players to pick up, while the sniper rifle and rocket launcher are rare spawns. This means you tend to spawn with an assault rifle and a pistol, and most of the time that's all you need. Grenades are common to flush players out of cover, break their shields before a gunfight starts, or just generally spam in one direction and hope to pick up a lucky kill. If I had to describe Halo's on-foot multiplayer, I'd call it sloppy. It just doesn't feel great, you know? It doesn't feel like you have control over combat. Maps are cramped, people are respawning right behind you, hit-scan weapons are chunking away your shields wherever you go. It's a little bit of a mess. I personally never found these small maps fun. Larger maps did exist. Blood Gulch is quite famous, obviously, but they weren't the norm. And even if you did play on them, the vehicles they offered were limited. You see, Bungie's weird hang-ups about giving players vehicles in the campaign persisted in multiplayer. They did allow you to tweak vehicle spawn settings when you created a match, but the defaults were very light. At least in Halo 1, vehicles were indestructible, so they were always available, and capturing the opposing team's transport gave you a very strong advantage, adding another layer of strategy onto the map as a whole. But still, it wasn't exactly what the system seemed to promise. Meanwhile, Gearbox understood exactly what people wanted. When they were handed the game to port, they made some very good decisions when it came to the multiplayer. Beyond just upping the default number of vehicles to support a larger map default player count, they also brought in two vehicles that weren't previously available in multiplayer, the existing Banshee and the brand new Rocket Warthog. In my personal experience as a PC player back then, teams on Blood Gulch had one or two of each Warthog, two Ghosts, a Banshee, and maybe a Scorpion depending on the server. A little more generous than the original, I'd say. Gearbox didn't stop there though. They added the previously unusable fuel rod gun as a pickup, as well as the planned but never implemented flamethrower. They also added 6 entirely new maps, each one way, way bigger than anything Bungie had created, and admittedly what the Xbox probably would have been able to handle, all with a heavy focus on vehicle play. Gearbox's efforts were strong ones. Halo's multiplayer made a decent splash on PC because of what they added, showcasing strengths Bungie wasn't interested in. Their decisions and additions elevated the game where Bungie would let it sag. I never played much of the smaller on-foot parts of Halo's multiplayer. Like I said, I didn't like it very much. I had better multiplayer shooters for that. But I came back for the vehicles. That is the Halo multiplayer I remember. Ghosts jousting on the massive bridge of Gephyrophobia, banshees screaming around each other in the air above Death Island, a veritable convoy of warthogs rumbling through infinity. This game just works better when you're in a vehicle. It was, actually, something new, something Bungie had done better than anyone else. And it took an entirely different company to see that potential. Potential that's now been lost again. 343 Industries, the people in charge of Halo now, didn't continue with Gearbox's version of things. Vehicles were pulled back out of maps, and the more interesting configurations have been relegated to a distinct Big Team Heavies playlist. You can't even play the larger maps in match-made 4v4s. What I've been showing you is a custom server I joined, and I was lucky to find it. If you try to go for Halo 1 matchmaking, this is what you get. I tried multiple times getting footage of it for this section, but even at peak hours on a Saturday, I couldn't find anything. The version of Halo multiplayer that I played, that I liked, is gone. I could go back to the original. I still have my CD, and Bungie was nice enough to patch the game back in 2014 to support modern systems and resolutions, but... What?
Blue team has the flag.
Well, Bungie aren't even hosting the patch on their website anymore. I had to grab it from the Internet Archive, so throw a couple bucks their way if you want to thank them for letting you keep experiencing... that? Multiplayer as a whole gets even stranger when you consider that the artistry involved in many of the multiplayer maps far exceeds that of anything in the campaign. Look at all of this geometry that focuses on vertical gameplay. Where was any of this? There are maps that I wish had been worked into single-player areas just because walking through them is more engaging than another hallway. Most of these maps feel like they could slot right into an existing space as an extension of what's already there, or a replacement for yet another copy and pasted room. Obviously, an individual multiplayer map is going to take less time overall to put together than a far larger single-player stage, but given how some of those turned out, maybe not. I think it's fascinating and sort of damning that there was time available for these, but not to add more variety to single-player maps that desperately needed it. This clearly isn't some slapped-together side project. All the maps are unique, there are textures used that don't show up anywhere in the campaign, all the different game modes and their unique assets, and the announcer. Were these made first, before the campaign was finalized? Was Halo supposed to have an even larger multiplayer focus at some point? Or did time and resources get siphoned away from places that needed it more in order to put the multiplayer together? I don't know, and I can only see what's in the game as it is now. And what's in the game is a series of confusing disappointments. Halo is a game that's barely a game. It's sloppily assembled, poorly written, and deeply incurious about the world it puts forward. It's a poor mishmash of better things that came before it. Its systems work well, but don't do anything particularly interesting. It's unwilling to have a conversation with the player about any of its ideas. Nobody in charge of it seemed to know what it was actually supposed to be. The world it creates is hollow, built on a bad understanding of its inspirations. The simplest questions poke holes that just keep growing. Halo ambles around for 10 levels that are really 4 levels twice, and 2 unique ones that end up folding back on themselves anyway. It explores nothing about the concepts it introduces. It shows you characters without character. It tells individual parts of different stories it doesn't try to connect. The stakes are non-existent until they're dire, until they're dropped. We end the game knowing exactly as much about what was in it as we did when we started. Who is the Master Chief? Who is Cortana? What is the Halo? Who are the Covenant? What is the Flood? It doesn't matter. The game's over now. What was the point of any of it? What message was this game trying to impart? What did any of what just happened have to say? There's absolutely a time and a place for light popcorn entertainment. I'm not going to pretend I'm somehow above just sitting back and enjoying a dumb, fun story. I like The Fifth Element and Jupiter Ascending, and those are pretty damn far from masterpieces of literature. But Halo wants to pretend there's more to it than that, and fans will fight bitterly to convince you there is. So where is it? I've played these first 3 games quite a lot, when they came out and much more recently, both for myself and for the Let's Play series a few years back. And each time, I come away with more unanswered questions, a worse understanding of what the games and the story were trying to do. Once you look at these games critically, you just can't stop, and the flaws overtake everything. The cracks just keep growing until you're hanging by your fingertips, desperately trying to avoid falling down a hole that leads... here. To making an overwrought video essay about why a 20-year-old video game is bad, actually. Don't play these games, don't be like me. I don't hate Halo, not really. I know it might be hard to believe after all this, but it's the truth. I do hate how it's handled, how Bungie never seemed to understand what they were doing, how the real strengths of the game got pushed aside to let the uninteresting parts take center stage, how it makes promises it never tries to keep, how the worst and least realized parts of the story constantly get the focus, how just when it seems like they're gonna nail it, they do something to screw it all up. I do think there's a place for a game series like Halo, a sprawling sci-fi epic that spans this sort of breadth of time and space, wrapped up in a slick first-person shooter-shaped package. But Halo isn't it. It doesn't manage to do those things. It tries, but it tries by leaning so heavily on its inspirations that it's totally eclipsed by them. Its own original ideas are left as tiny, broken pieces that never fit properly with what it was taking from. So why did we never see anything better come out? Why did nothing ever manage to rush past Halo and take its place? Great questions. I wish I knew the answers. I said at the beginning that the glut of Halo killers that came out failed not just because they were bad on their own, but because they were imitating a bad product. I do believe that. Seen outside the context of something that's already popular, Halo's flaws are obvious. So why does Halo get to enjoy that popularity even though it's been made clear time and time again that it just doesn't work? Why are other games judged so much more harshly for less severe problems, while Halo gets a pass? Whatever Microsoft paid for this game back in 1999 or 2000 or whenever, they've made back in spades. Shovels. Backhoes, those giant German bucket wheel excavators. Halo is an empire. Reception to basically every product in this franchise for over a decade has been lukewarm to outright negative, but still, it persists. Are people finally getting over it? I don't know, they keep buying the things. Who had confidence in Halo Infinite after 4 and 5 disappointed, after the years of publicly messy development? But they bought it because it was Halo. It was the thing they knew. And that sort of baseless loyalty is worth more to Microsoft than making a good product. They don't have to try, they just have to put the name on something that looks like Halo and they know they'll make their money back. Whatever Halo could have once had at its core has been lost, and the entire thing has been reduced to sheer basic aesthetics. But I don't think that's a new thing. This first game was always exactly the same way. Halo was never a good game. I'm glad we can finally admit that. I don't care if you like Halo. It doesn't offend me. Play it, enjoy it, have a good time. I'm glad that you can. But maybe take the time to engage with its most obvious inspirations. Play Half-Life, play Unreal, then play Quake and Doom and Duke Nukem and Blood, read Ringworld and the Ringworld Engineers, watch Alien and Aliens. See for yourself what Halo was trying to imitate, and see what it missed. It's very obvious when you know where to look. And once you start looking, you might find something you like better. Thanks for listening to all this. I'm glad to finally get it out of my system. I thought the Let's Play series would do it, but I just wanted everything in one place. Of course, this was only about the first game, so who knows what the future will hold. Hey, did you know that I wrote my own science fiction trilogy? It's true, I did. So there's me putting my money where my mouth is in regards to storytelling. Maybe check them out, see if they're your jam. Link's in the description, take a look. Other than that, I've got a Ko-Fi link if you want to toss some spare change at me. I don't know, do you also not like this game and have been forced to carry that this entire time? Or are you a Halo superfan and you've just been hate-watching for the last, all this? Talk at me in the comments, and if you're polite about things, I'll try to say something back. While you're there, do the other YouTube pleasantries, you know what they are, you've been on the internet before. Send this video to your favorite review site so someone can write an op-ed about it in response. That's still a thing, right? Okay, I think I'm done talking. I hope everybody has a great day, and don't take video games too seriously, just look what happens to you.